The will was read, the room exploded, and the heir they were about to destroy, he was already dead, or so they thought. In the merciless Arizona frontier, one man's act of mercy would ignite a war over blood, legacy, and betrayal. A dying rancher, a nameless boy who saved him, and two sons who would stop at nothing, not even murder, to reclaim what they believed was theirs. This is the story of Elias Hale, the outsider who inherited an empire, the target who wouldn't stay buried, and the silent storm that shattered a dynasty. Stay until the end, like this video, and comment your city below. I want to see how far this story travels. The desert doesn't forgive. It swallows the weak, buries the foolish, and leaves only bone and dust where men once stood. In the summer of 1891, the Arizona Territory was a land of extremes, beauty and brutality woven so tightly together that you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The sky stretched endless and cruel, the sun a merciless judge over red rock and scrubland that rolled toward horizons sharp enough to cut the eye. And in the heart of that wilderness, Victor Hale had built an empire. The Hale Ranch wasn't just land, it was legacy. 15,000 acres of cattle, water rights, and reputation. A sprawling estate of white stone and dark wood that rose from the desert like a fortress, its shadow long enough to cool half the town of Redemption Springs. Victor Hale was a name that commanded respect, fear, and envy in equal measure. He was a man who had carved his kingdom from nothing, who had fought Apaches, outlaws, and droughts, and who had survived them all. But on a blistering afternoon in late July, Victor Hale was dying. His horse had stumbled in a dry wash 20 miles from the estate, throwing him hard against the rocks. His leg was shattered, bone visible through torn flesh, blood pooling dark and fast beneath him. The animal had bolted, spooked by the scent of injury, leaving Victor alone in the sun with only the vultures beginning to circle overhead. He tried to crawl, made it maybe 10 feet before the pain dragged him back down into the dirt. His vision blurred, his breath came shallow and wet. He thought of his sons, Marcus, cold and calculating, Dean, wild and reckless, and wondered if either of them would mourn him, or if they'd simply fight over the scraps before his body was even cold. Then he saw the boy. At first, Victor thought it was a mirage, a small figure moving through the heat shimmer, silent as smoke. But the boy was real, maybe 10 years old, rail-thin, dressed in rags that might have once been clothes. His skin was burned dark by the sun, his hair a tangled mess, his eyes too old for his face. He didn't speak, didn't ask questions. Just knelt beside Victor, looked at the wound with an expression that was neither shocked nor frightened, and went to work. The boy moved with eerie precision. He tore strips from his own shirt, packed the wound to slow the bleeding, found a straight branch and fashioned a crude splint using desert grass and his bootlaces. He didn't flinch at the blood, didn't hesitate. And when Victor groaned in agony, the boy met his gaze with something that looked almost like understanding. Who are you?" Victor rasped. The boy said nothing, just finished the binding, stood, and disappeared back into the desert as silently as he'd come. Victor Hale survived that day. A passing cattle driver found him hours later, half delirious but alive, and brought him back to the ranch. The doctors said it was a miracle, that he should have bled out in minutes, that the makeshift splint had saved the leg, that whoever had done it knew exactly what they were doing. But when Victor asked about the boy, no one knew who he was talking about. For weeks, Victor searched. He sent men into the desert, questioned every homestead and camp within 50 miles. Nothing. The boy was a ghost, nameless, faceless, gone. Until 3 years later, when Victor found him again. 1894. Redemption Springs. The town was little more than a dusty crossroads, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a church that saw more use as a meeting hall than a place of worship. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were currency and grudges lasted generations. Victor had come to town for supplies, riding in the back of the wagon because his leg, though healed, still gave him trouble in the saddle. He was watching the street roll past when he saw him, the boy. Older now, maybe 13, but unmistakable. Same dark eyes, same silent, watchful presence. He was sitting on the steps of the general store, thin as wire, shoulders hunched, staring at nothing. Victor stopped the wagon so fast the driver nearly fell off the bench. "That boy," Victor said, pointing. "I know him." The driver squinted. "That's nobody, Mr. Hale, just some orphan. Showed up a few months back. Don't talk much. Does odd jobs for food." Victor climbed down from the wagon, ignoring the protest from his bad leg, and crossed the street. The boy looked up as he approached, and for just a moment something flickered in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or resignation. "You remember me?" Victor asked. The boy didn't answer. "3 years ago, out in the wash, you saved my life." Still nothing. But the boy didn't look away. Victor crouched down, joints cracking until they were eye level. "What's your name, son?" Silence. "You got family? Anyone looking after you?" The boy's jaw tightened. Then slowly, he shook his head. Victor studied him. This strange, silent child who had pulled him back from death and asked for nothing in return. He saw the hunger in the boy's face, the exhaustion, the way his hands were scarred and calloused from work no child should be doing, and he made a decision that would change everything. "You're coming with me," Victor said. The boy blinked. "Why?" The first word he'd spoken. His voice was rough, unused. "Because I owe you," Victor said simply, "and because I don't leave debts unpaid." The Hale estate was a different world. Where Redemption Springs was dust and desperation, the ranch was order and abundance. The main house stood 3 stories tall with wide verandas and tall windows that caught the desert light. There were stables for 20 horses, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, a smokehouse, a root cellar, and gardens that somehow stayed green even in the August heat. And inside there was wealth, furniture shipped from the East, rugs from Persia, paintings in gilded frames. The kind of wealth that made men kill. When Victor brought the boy home, the household erupted. "You brought what home?" Marcus Hale stood in the foyer, arms crossed, his face a mask of cold fury. He was 24, tall and severe, with his father's sharp features and none of his warmth. "A street rat? Father, have you lost your mind?" "Watch your tone," Victor said quietly. "He probably has lice," Dean drawled from the staircase. He was 22, handsome in a careless way, leaning against the banister with a glass of whiskey already in hand despite the early hour. "Or worse, you planning to let him sleep in the house?" "I'm planning to give him a home," Victor said. "Same as I gave you." "We're your sons," Marcus snapped, "and he saved my life." The silence that followed was sharp enough to draw blood. The boy stood in the center of the foyer, small and silent, taking in the opulence around him with no expression at all. He didn't flinch under Marcus's glare or Dean's smirk. He just waited. "He'll have a room," Victor continued. "He'll be fed, clothed, and educated. And he'll be treated with the same respect as anyone else under this roof. Is that understood?" "You can't be serious," Marcus started. "Is that understood?" Marcus's jaw worked. Then he turned and walked away without another word. Dean just laughed, drained his glass, and followed his brother up the stairs. Victor turned to the boy. "They'll come around," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Come on, let's get you cleaned up." The boy was given a room on the second floor, small but clean, with a real bed and a window that looked out over the southern pastures. He was given clothes that fit, meals that filled him, and for the first time in his life, a name. "Elias," Victor said one evening, a week after bringing him home. They were sitting on the veranda, watching the sun bleed red across the horizon. "It means the Lord is my God." Seemed fitting. The boy, Elias, turned the name over in his mind, testing it, tasting it. "Elias Hale," Victor continued. "If you're going to live here, you carry the name. You're family now." Elias looked at him, something unreadable in his dark eyes. "I'm not your son." "No," Victor agreed, "but you could be." Elias didn't respond, but he didn't refuse either. The months that followed were a study in contrasts. Elias learned quickly how to read, how to write, how to sit at a table and use silverware instead of his hands. He was quiet. almost unnervingly so, but he absorbed everything. Victor hired a tutor, a stern woman from Boston who taught him history, mathematics, literature. Within 6 months, Elias was reading Shakespeare. Within a year, he could argue philosophy. But while his mind grew sharper, his place in the household remained precarious. Marcus treated him like a servant. He'd snap orders at Elias during meals, demand that he fetch things, correct his grammar with a sneer. "Just because father's gone soft doesn't mean you belong here," Marcus said once, voice low enough that only Elias could hear. "You're nothing, and you'll always be nothing." Elias said nothing, just met Marcus's gaze and went back to his book. Dean was worse in different ways. He didn't ignore Elias, he toyed with him. He'd accidentally spill drinks on Elias's clothes, trip him in hallways, mock him in front of the ranch hands. "Look at the little charity case," Dean would laugh, "playing dress-up in our house." But Elias never reacted, never fought back. He endured it all with the same silent, watchful patience he'd shown that day in the desert. And slowly, quietly, he learned. He learned the ranch, not from books, but from the land itself. He'd wake before dawn and ride out with the ranch hands, watching how they moved the cattle, how they read the weather, how they knew when a water hole was about to dry up. He learned which pastures could handle grazing and which needed rest. He learned how to mend fences, deliver calves, track predators. While Marcus buried himself in ledgers and Dean chased women in town, Elias learned to see the ranch as a living thing, fragile, interconnected, demanding respect. And Victor noticed. "You've got a gift for this," Victor said one evening, finding Elias in the stables. "The land, I mean. Most men see it as something to conquer. You see it as something to understand." Elias looked up from the horse he was brushing. "It's not mine to conquer." Victor smiled faintly. "Not yet." 1898, 4 years later. Elias was 17 now, tall, lean, with the kind of quiet strength that came from years of hard work. His face had lost its boyish softness, replaced by sharp lines and a jaw that could have been carved from stone. He still didn't speak unless spoken to, but when he did, people listened. He was no longer the silent boy Victor had found on the steps. He was something else now, something harder to define, and Victor knew it was time. "There's a woman," Victor said one morning over breakfast. Marcus and Dean were still asleep as usual, leaving just the two of them at the long dining table. Margaret Ashford, Judge Ashford's daughter. Good family, educated, beautiful. Elias looked up from his plate, wary. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I've arranged for you to meet her," Victor said calmly. "There's a dinner next week at the Ashford estate. You'll attend as my son and heir." The words hung in the air like gunpowder waiting for a spark. "Heir," Elias repeated. "You think I haven't noticed?" Victor leaned back in his chair, studying him. "Marcus cares about profit. Dean cares about pleasure. But you care about the land, about doing things right. That's what this ranch needs. That's what I need." "Your sons, my sons," Victor interrupted, "will inherit what they've earned, which frankly isn't much." He paused. "You saved my life, Elias, twice. Once in the desert, and again when you reminded me what it means to build something worth leaving behind." Elias didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. Victor smiled. "The dinner's next Saturday. Wear the blue suit, and for God's sake, try to smile." The Ashford estate was smaller than the Hale Ranch, but older, built in the Spanish style, with thick adobe walls and a courtyard full of flowering vines. Judge Ashford was a powerful man in the territory, his word carrying weight in land disputes, water rights, and politics. An alliance with his family would cement the Hale legacy for generations. Elias arrived with Victor in the carriage, dressed in the blue suit, his hair combed back, his hands scrubbed clean. He looked every inch the gentleman, polished, composed, unremarkable. Margaret Ashford was waiting in the parlor. She was beautiful in the way that high society demanded. Delicate features, pale skin, dark hair pinned in elaborate curls. Her dress was expensive, her posture perfect, her smile practiced. She greeted Victor warmly, then turned to Elias. "Miss Ashford," Elias said, bowing slightly. "It's a pleasure." "Mr. Hale," she replied, her voice cool and musical. "Father has told me so much about your family." They sat for dinner. A formal affair with too many courses and too much small talk. Margaret spoke about her time at finishing school in San Francisco, about the opera she'd seen, the books she'd read. Elias listened politely, answered when prompted, but offered little of himself. Then, halfway through the meal, Judge Ashford asked the question. "So, Elias," the judge said, cutting into his steak, "Victor tells me you've become quite indispensable at the ranch. Tell me, what's your background? Where did your family come from?" The table went still. Elias met the judge's gaze evenly. "I don't have a family, sir. Mr. Hale took me in when I was a boy." "Took you in?" Margaret's mother, a thin, sharp-eyed woman, leaned forward. "From where?" "The streets of Redemption Springs," Elias said simply. The silence that followed was suffocating. Margaret's fork clattered against her plate. "You're an orphan?" "I am." Her face twisted, not with pity, but with something colder. Disgust. "And you let me believe—" She turned to Victor, eyes blazing. "You brought a foundling to my table? Expected me to—" She couldn't even finish the sentence. "Miss Ashford," Victor began, his voice tight. But Margaret was already standing. "I will not be humiliated like this. My father may owe you favors, Mr. Hale, but I owe you nothing." She looked at Elias, her lip curling. "And I certainly won't be married off to some nameless beggar playing dress-up in borrowed clothes." She swept out of the room, her mother following in a hiss of skirts. Judge Ashford cleared his throat awkwardly. "Victor, I'm sorry. If I'd known—" "Save it," Victor said coldly. He stood, gesturing to Elias. "We're leaving." They rode home in silence. Elias stared out the window at the dark desert rolling past, his face unreadable. Finally, Victor spoke. "She's a fool." Elias didn't respond. "You're worth 10 of her, 100. And if she can't see that, it doesn't matter," Elias said quietly. Victor turned to him, frowning. "Of course it matters." "No." Elias met his gaze, and in his eyes was something hard and ancient. "I've always known what I am, a charity case, an outsider. Nothing's changed." "Everything's changed," Victor said fiercely. "Because tonight, I'm rewriting my will. And when I'm done, you'll inherit everything. The ranch, the land, the name. All of it." Elias stared at him. "You can't." "I can. And I will." Victor's jaw was set, his decision final. "Marcus and Dean have had their chances. They've wasted them. But you've earned this. You've bled for this." He paused. "You're my son, Elias. Not by blood, but by choice. And that's worth more." Elias looked away, his throat tight. And somewhere in the darkness behind them, fate began to sharpen its blade. 3 months later, Victor Hale died on a cold November morning. The doctor said it was his heart, sudden, painless, a mercy given the way some men go. He was found in his study, slumped over his desk, a pen still in his hand. On the paper in front of him was a single word: Elias. The funeral was held 3 days later. Half the territory came: ranchers, politicians, business partners. They filed past the coffin, offered condolences, spoke in hushed tones about legacy and loss. Marcus stood at the front, stone-faced and silent. Dean stood beside him, red-eyed, reeking of whiskey, and Elias stood alone at the back, watching it all with the same quiet, unreadable expression he always wore. No one spoke to him. No one acknowledged him. He was, as always, invisible. The will was read 1 week later in the study, the same room where Victor had died. The family lawyer, a thin man named Graves, sat behind the desk with the document in front of him. Marcus and Dean sat across from him, tense and expectant. Elias stood near the window, arms crossed, saying nothing. Clara, one of the housemaids, a young woman with sharp eyes and a quiet demeanor, stood just outside the door, ostensibly arranging flowers. But she was listening. She always listened. "Gentlemen," Graves began, adjusting his spectacles, "your father's estate is substantial. Land, livestock, investments, and liquid assets totaling approximately $200,000. Marcus leaned forward. Dean's leg bounced with nervous energy. "The distribution," Graves continued, is as follows. He cleared his throat. To Marcus Hale, a sum of $20,000 and the homestead in Tucson. Marcus's face went pale. 20,000? That's to Dean Hale. A sum of $15,000 and the mineral rights to the northern quarter. Dean laughed, a short, bitter sound. That's it? 15,000 and some rocks? And to Elias Hale, Graves said, his voice steady. The entirety of the Hale Ranch, including all land, water rights, livestock, the main estate, and all remaining assets. The room exploded. Marcus shot to his feet. That's impossible. He's not even blood, Dean shouted. The will is legal and binding, Graves said firmly. Your father was of sound mind when he executed it, witnessed and notarized. This is a mistake. It's not a mistake, Mr. Hale. Graves looked at Marcus over his spectacles. Your father made his intentions very clear. Marcus turned to Elias, his face twisted with rage. You manipulated him, wormed your way in like the parasite you are. That's enough, Graves snapped. But Marcus wasn't done. He crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbed Elias by the collar, and slammed him against the wall. You think you've won? He hissed. You think you can just take what's ours? Elias didn't fight back, didn't even flinch, just looked at Marcus with those dark, unreadable eyes and said, Let go. Something in his voice made Marcus hesitate, made him realize, maybe for the first time, that Elias wasn't afraid of him, had never been afraid. He let go, stepped back. Elias straightened his collar calmly. I didn't ask for this. But you'll take it, Dean said bitterly. Elias looked at him, then at Marcus, then at Graves. I'll honor Victor's wishes, he said quietly. That's all. He walked out of the room without another word. And in the hallway, Clara watched him go, her heart pounding, her mind racing. Because she'd seen the look in Marcus's eyes, and she knew what came next. The days after the will reading were measured in silence and sideways glances. Elias moved through the ranch like a ghost, performing the same tasks he'd always done, checking fence lines, overseeing the cattle rotations, meeting with the foreman about winter feed. He didn't announce himself as the new owner, didn't demand acknowledgement or respect. He simply continued the work as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The ranch hands felt it first. They'd worked under Victor Hale for decades, knew his sons, knew their weaknesses. Marcus was all ledgers and cold calculation, good with numbers but blind to the rhythms of the land. Dean was charm without substance, the kind of man who'd rather drink and gamble than mend a fence. But Elias was different. He knew their names, knew which man had a sick wife, which one needed an advance on wages to fix his roof. He'd earned their respect the hard way, through sweat and silence and showing up before dawn every single day. When word spread that Elias had inherited everything, there was no revolt, no outcry, just a quiet, collective nod. Of course it was him. Who else could it be? But inside the main house, the air had turned poisonous. Marcus stopped speaking to Elias entirely. He'd pass him in hallways without acknowledgement, eat meals in his room, spend hours locked in what had been Victor's study. His study now, he insisted, though the servants knew better than to correct him. He pored over the will again and again, searching for loopholes, inconsistencies, anything that could be challenged in court. Dean, meanwhile, descended into a spiral of bitterness and bourbon. He'd stumble home at dawn, reeking of the saloon, his pockets empty, his eyes hollow. He'd curse Elias's name to anyone who'd listen, though most stopped listening after the first week. Self-pity was boring, even when it came wrapped in rage. And through it all, Clara watched. She'd been at the Hale Ranch for 3 years, hired when her father's farm went under, desperate for work that would keep her from the grim alternatives available to young women with no family and no prospects. She was 22 now, plain in the way that made people overlook her, which suited her fine. Invisibility was a kind of armor. She saw everything, heard everything. The servants always did. She'd watched Elias endure years of Marcus's contempt and Dean's cruelty without complaint. She'd seen him work harder than anyone, ask for nothing, and somehow still carry himself with a quiet dignity that neither of the biological sons could manage. And she'd seen Victor's face when he looked at Elias, the pride there, the hope, the certainty that he'd made the right choice. Now she saw the danger. It started small. Whispered conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. Meetings between Marcus and Dean that happened behind closed doors, always late at night, always accompanied by the clink of glasses and low, urgent voices. The lawyer, Graves, visited twice more, both times leaving with his face pale and his briefcase clutched tight. Clara didn't need to hear the words to know what was being planned. She'd grown up poor, had learned early that the world ran on cruelty disguised as pragmatism. Men like Marcus didn't accept loss. They renegotiated the terms. She tried to warn Elias once. It was early December, the desert cold biting through the morning air. She found him in the stables, brushing down his horse, a steel-gray mare named Ash that he'd gentled from a wild Mustang 3 years ago. "Mr. Hale," she said quietly. He looked up, surprised. The servants rarely addressed him directly. "Clara, is something wrong?" She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder to make sure they were alone. "I think you should be careful." His brow furrowed. "Careful of what?" "Your brothers," she said, then corrected herself. "Marcus and Dean, they're planning something." "Planning what?" "I don't know exactly, but I hear things. The way they talk when they think no one's listening." She twisted her hands together, nervous. "They're angry, Mr. Hale, and angry men do stupid things." Elias studied her for a long moment, then went back to brushing the mare. "I appreciate the concern, Clara, but I'm not afraid of them." "Maybe you should be." He paused, his hand stilling on the horse's flank. When he looked at her again, there was something old in his eyes, something that had survived the desert, the hunger, the years of being treated like he didn't belong. "I've spent my whole life being afraid," he said quietly, "of starving, of being thrown out, of not being good enough. I'm done with that. But if they want the ranch, they can take me to court. Victor's will is ironclad. Graves already told them as much." He resumed brushing, his movement steady. "And if they want to hate me, let them hate me. I didn't ask for this, Clara, but I won't run from it either." She wanted to argue, wanted to grab him by the shoulders and shake him until he understood that this wasn't about courts or legal documents. This was about pride and greed and the kind of rage that didn't care about right or wrong. But she could see it in his face, the stubborn, silent determination that had carried him this far. So she just nodded and left him there, alone with his horse and his certainty, and prayed she was wrong. 2 weeks later, Marcus made his move, but not the one Clara had feared. He called a meeting in the main parlor, summoning Elias with a terseness that barely masked his fury. Dean was already there when Elias arrived, sprawled in a chair with a glass in his hand and a smirk on his face. "Sit," Marcus said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Elias remained standing. "What's this about?" "It's about the ranch. And the future." Marcus's voice was clipped, businesslike. "I've consulted with several legal experts. The will stands. I'm not contesting it." Elias raised an eyebrow. "That's unexpected." "Don't flatter yourself. I'm not conceding because you deserve it. I'm conceding because fighting it would cost more than it's worth." Marcus leaned back, fingers steepled. "But the ranch can't function with this kind of division. The hands are confused about who's in charge. The investors are nervous. So here's my proposal. We form a partnership. You run the day-to-day operations, since that's apparently your strength, and I handle the finances and expansion, equal say in all major decisions." "And me?" Dean asked, his words slightly slurred. "What do I get?" "You get to stay out of trouble," Marcus said coldly, "and draw a monthly allowance as a non-voting partner." Dean laughed bitterly, but didn't argue. Elias considered the offer. It was reasonable on the surface, a way to keep the peace, maintain stability, honor Victor's intent while acknowledging the reality of blood ties. Marcus was smart, cold, but smart. And this proposal had the feel of something carefully calculated to appear fair while hiding barbs beneath. "What happens if we disagree?" Elias asked. "On a major decision?" "Then we bring in an arbiter, someone neutral." "Who you'd choose?" Marcus's smile was thin. "I'd propose candidates. You'd have veto power." It was a trap. Elias knew it instinctively, though he couldn't yet see the shape of it. But refusing outright would make him look unreasonable, petty, Everything Victor's enemies had always accused him of being. "I'll think about it," Elias said. "Don't think too long," Marcus replied. "The bank note on the northern expansion comes due in March. We'll need to present a unified front." Elias left the parlor feeling like he'd just stepped into quicksand disguised as solid ground. That night, Clara found a folded piece of paper slipped under her door. No signature, just 3 words in hurried script. "Don't trust them." She burned it immediately, her hands shaking. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in subtle sabotage. Marcus began holding meetings with the ranch's investors without informing Elias, small gatherings over dinner in town, casual conversations that just happened to touch on concerns about leadership stability and the risks of leaving a ranch this size to someone with no experience in high finance. He never said anything directly actionable, just planted seeds of doubt, watered them with whiskey, and carefully chosen words. Meanwhile, Dean started spending more time with the ranch hands, buying them drinks, sympathizing about the awkward situation, wondering aloud how long before Elias's inexperience got someone hurt. He was charming when he wanted to be, and drunk men had short memories for past slights. Elias felt the ground shifting beneath him, but couldn't prove anything. The hands still greeted him respectfully. The investors still returned his letters. Everything looked fine on the surface, but the cracks were spreading. Then came the incident with the Garrett girl. Redemption Springs had grown over the years, its population swelling with families drawn by the promise of land and water rights. Among them were the Garretts, a respectable family who ran the town's largest general store. Their daughter, Lillian, was 19, pretty in a wholesome way, and by all accounts, intelligent and well-mannered. Marcus arranged the introduction at a church social in late January, presenting it as a neighborly gesture. "Elias," he said, guiding him toward where Lillian stood with her parents, "I'd like you to meet the Garretts. Mr. Garrett supplies most of our dry goods." The conversation started pleasantly enough. Mr. Garrett was jovial, his wife warm, and Lillian smiled when Elias spoke to her. They talked about books. She'd read some of the same volumes Victor had insisted Elias study, and for a brief moment Elias felt something almost like normalcy. Then Mrs. Garrett asked the question. "So, Mr. Hale, Marcus tells us you've taken over management of the ranch. That must be quite a responsibility for someone so young. Where did your family come from, originally? Back east?" The trap had been set so carefully that Elias almost didn't see it. He could lie, invent a history, a respectable lineage, or he could tell the truth and watch the warmth drain from their faces. He chose honesty. "I don't have a family, Mrs. Garrett. Victor Hale took me in when I was 13. Before that, I was on my own." The change was instant. Mrs. Garrett's smile froze. Mr. Garrett's bonhomie evaporated, and Lillian, sweet, bookish Lillian, took a small step backward as if proximity to him might be contagious. "I see," Mrs. Garrett said faintly. "How charitable of Mr. Hale." "Yes," her husband added, his voice carefully neutral. "Quite charitable indeed." They made their excuses within minutes. Elias watched them retreat across the social hall, saw Mrs. Garrett lean close to her husband, whispering urgently, saw Lillian glance back once, her expression a mix of pity and relief. Marcus appeared at his elbow, his face a mask of false sympathy. "That's unfortunate. I was hoping they'd be more open-minded." Elias turned to him slowly. "You told them to ask." "I told them the truth," Marcus said mildly, "that you're a valued member of our household with an interesting background. How they interpreted that isn't my responsibility." "You set me up." "I introduced you to a respectable family. What happened after that," Marcus shrugged, "is just the natural consequence of your circumstances." Elias felt rage building in his chest, hot and tight, but he swallowed it down, forced his face smooth, his voice level. "Is this how it's going to be? You'll smile to my face and sabotage me behind my back?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Marcus said, but his eyes were gleaming with satisfaction. "I'm simply trying to help you integrate into society. It's not my fault that society has standards." He walked away before Elias could respond, leaving him standing alone in a room full of people who now knew exactly what he was. A foundling, a charity case, a pretender in borrowed clothes. Clara watched from across the room, her heart breaking for him. She saw the way his shoulders tensed, the way his hands curled into fists and then deliberately relaxed. Saw him standing there, isolated and exposed, while Marcus's laughter carried from the other side of the hall. And she made a decision. That night, after the household had gone to bed, Clara slipped out of the servants' quarters and made her way to the main house. She'd never been in Elias's room. It would be scandalous, ruinous, if anyone found out. But she couldn't stay silent any longer. She knocked softly on his door. When he opened it, still dressed, clearly not sleeping, his surprise was evident. "Clara, what are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," she said quietly. "Please." He hesitated, then stepped aside to let her in, leaving the door slightly ajar. Propriety, even in crisis. His room was spare, almost monastic. A bed, a desk, a bookshelf. Nothing excessive. Nothing wasted. "You shouldn't be here," he said, but not unkindly. "I know." She twisted her hands together, gathering courage. "But I can't watch this anymore. What Marcus did tonight, it's only going to get worse. I can handle Marcus." "Can you?" She met his eyes. "He's destroying your reputation piece by piece, making sure that everyone in town sees you as an outsider who doesn't belong. And once he's isolated you completely, once he's turned the investors and the workers and the whole territory against you, then what?" Elias asked. "What's the end game? He can't contest the will. We already established that." "He doesn't need to contest it," Clara said urgently. "He just needs to make you fail. Make the ranch lose money under your management. Make you look incompetent. And then when you're desperate, when the debts pile up and the bank starts circling, he'll offer to buy you out for a fraction of what it's worth. And you'll have to take it, because you won't have any other choice." Elias stared at her, the implications sinking in. "That's elaborate." "Marcus is elaborate," Clara said. "He's been planning this since the moment the will was read. Maybe longer. And Dean? Dean's just angry. He'll do whatever Marcus tells him if it means hurting you." Elias turned away, moving to the window. Outside, the desert stretched dark and endless under a sky thick with stars. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because it's not fair," Clara said simply. "Victor chose you for a reason. You earned this, and watching them destroy you for the crime of being good at what you do?" Her voice caught. "Someone has to be on your side." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw past the plain face and the maid's uniform to the sharp intelligence beneath. The courage it had taken to come here, the risk she was assuming just by warning him. "Thank you," he said quietly. She nodded, throat tight, and turned to leave. But at the door she paused. "Mr. Hale, be careful. Please." "I will." But they both knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep. The situation escalated in March, just as Marcus had predicted. The banknote came due. $40,000 borrowed for an expansion into mining operations on the northern quarter. Victor had started the project before his death, convinced that the mineral surveys showed promise, but the operation had been slow to develop, plagued by equipment failures and labor disputes. Marcus called a meeting with the bank president, Mr. Holloway, without informing Elias until the night before. "It's a courtesy meeting," Marcus said dismissively when Elias confronted him. "Just updating him on the ranch's financial status. You're welcome to attend, of course." Elias attended and walked into an ambush. Holloway was a portly man with calculating eyes and a smile that never reached them. He greeted Elias politely but addressed most of his comments to Marcus, who had clearly primed him in advance. "The ranch's position is complicated," Marcus explained, spreading ledgers across the table. "The cattle operation is stable, but the mining venture has been a drain on resources. We've invested nearly $60,000 total, with minimal return." "That's because the operation needs time," Elias interjected. "The surveys showed—" "Surveys can be wrong," Marcus said smoothly. "And in the meantime, we're hemorrhaging money. Mr. Holloway, I've prepared a restructuring proposal that would allow us to meet our obligations while scaling back the mining operation." Holloway reviewed the documents, nodding along. "This seems reasonable, Marcus. Prudent, even." "Except it's not his decision to make," Elias said, keeping his voice level despite the anger rising in his chest. "I'm the owner. Any restructuring needs my approval. Of course, Marcus said. I'm simply presenting options, though I should mention, he glanced at Holloway. The bank has concerns about leadership cohesion. Isn't that right? Holloway cleared his throat. Well, yes, there have been questions about the transition of ownership, about experience levels in financial management. I see. Elias looked between them. And these questions, they started when exactly? The silence was answer enough. This is Marcus's doing, Elias said flatly. He's been poisoning the well, making you doubt my competence so he can position himself as the solution. That's a serious accusation, Holloway said, bristling. It's the truth. Marcus leaned back, the picture of wounded dignity. I'm trying to save this ranch, Elias. If you can't see that, if your pride is more important than the family legacy, then maybe the concerns about your judgment are justified. Elias wanted to lunge across the table, wanted to grab Marcus by his perfectly pressed collar and shake him until that smug expression cracked. But he forced himself to breathe, to think. How much time do we have, Geese? He asked Holloway. 60 days, the bank president replied. After that, we'll need to discuss collateral options, meaning they'd start seizing assets, piece by piece, until the ranch was gutted. Elias stood. You'll have your money, in full. Elias, Marcus started. Stay out of it, Elias snapped. You've done enough. He left the bank with his mind racing. 60 days to find $40,000. The ranch had assets, but most were tied up in land and livestock, not easily liquidated. The cattle wouldn't be ready for market until late spring. The mining operation was a loss. And if he started selling off land, it would signal desperation, bringing scavengers circling, unless an idea began to form. Dangerous. Risky. But possible. He went to find Clara. She was in the kitchen, helping the cook prepare dinner. When she saw his face, she immediately set down her knife and followed him outside, away from listening ears. I need your help, he said without preamble. Anything. How much do you know about the ranch's operations, the details, supply contracts, buyer relationships, inventory? She blinked, surprised. More than you'd think. I handle a lot of the household accounts, and I've picked up things from listening to your father to Victor over the years. Could you help me audit the books? All of them. I need to know exactly where every dollar goes, every contract we have, every debt and credit. You think Marcus has been hiding something? I think Marcus has been very careful, but careful people make patterns, and patterns can be found. He paused. This will take time, late nights, and if he finds out, he won't, Clara said firmly. When do we start? Tonight. They worked in secret, meeting after midnight in the ranch office when the rest of the household slept. Clara proved invaluable. She had a head for numbers that surprised even Elias, could spot discrepancies and anomalies that he'd have missed. And she was meticulous, documenting everything they found. The picture that emerged was damning. Marcus had been skimming. Not large amounts. He was too smart for that. But small percentages here and there. A supply contract paid at inflated prices to a company he partially owned. Cattle sold below market rate to a buyer who kicked back a portion. Equipment purchased new when used would have sufficed, with the difference vanishing into vaguely labeled expenses. Over 3 years, he'd siphoned nearly $30,000. It's brilliant, Clara whispered, horrified. He's been stealing from the ranch while making it look like normal business operations. And if I'd just accepted his partnership proposal, he'd have had cover to keep doing it, Elias said grimly. Shared authority means shared blame. What are you going to do? Elias looked at the evidence spread across the desk. Ledgers, receipts, contracts. Enough to destroy Marcus. Enough to reclaim what had been stolen and solve the bank crisis. But also enough to shatter what remained of the Hale family. I'm going to confront him, Elias said. Privately. Give him a chance to make this right. He won't take it, Clara warned. Probably not. But I have to try. He found Marcus the next morning in the study, reviewing correspondence. Dean was there too, nursing a hangover and a resentment that had curdled into something uglier than simple jealousy. We need to talk, Elias said, closing the door behind him. Marcus didn't look up. I'm busy. It's about the $30,000 you've stolen from the ranch. That got his attention. Marcus's head snapped up, his face carefully blank. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. Elias dropped the ledger on the desk. I have documentation, contracts, receipts, payment records, everything. Dean leaned forward, suddenly interested. Marcus? What's he talking about? Nothing, Marcus said tightly. This is a desperate attempt to... The consolidated supply contract, Elias interrupted. You're listed as a silent partner. Every order from them to the ranch was marked up 20%, with your share paid out quarterly through a shell account. He flipped pages. The Brennan cattle sale last fall, below market rate by 15%, with Brennan making a personal payment to you the following week. More pages. The mining equipment purchase. Enough, Marcus said coldly. You've been bleeding this ranch dry, Elias continued, his voice hard, while lecturing me about responsibility and experience, while sabotaging me at every turn, also you could line your pockets. Dean was staring at his brother, something like horror dawning on his face. Marcus, tell me this isn't true. Marcus ignored him, his eyes locked on Elias. What do you want? I want you to return the money, all of it, and then I want you gone. Gone? Off the ranch, out of the family business. You can keep whatever Victor left you in the will. That's yours by right. But your access to the ranch finances ends today. Marcus stood slowly, his face a mask of cold rage. You self-righteous little bastard. You think you can just erase me? I'm a Hale by blood, and you're a thief by choice, Elias shot back. Be grateful I'm not taking this to the sheriff. You won't, Marcus said with certainty, because that would destroy the ranch's reputation, make us look incompetent and corrupt. The investors would scatter, the bank would panic, everything would collapse. He was right, and they both knew it. So here's what's going to happen, Marcus continued, his voice dropping to something dangerous. You're going to destroy that evidence, accept my partnership proposal, and we're going to continue as if this conversation never happened, because if you try to push me out, if you try to expose me, I'll burn this whole place to the ground before I let you have it. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Elias looked at him, this man he'd lived with for years who tormented him, undermined him, and now threatened him, and felt something cold and final settle in his chest. No, he said simply. Marcus's expression flickered. What? I said no. Keep the money if you want. I'll make it up another way. But you're done here. And if you try to interfere, if you try to sabotage me again, I'll release every document I have to every newspaper in the territory. Let the court of public opinion decide who the real Hale heir is. For a long moment, Marcus just stared at him. Then he smiled, thin and sharp and utterly without humor. You've made a mistake, Elias, he said softly. A big one. He brushed past Elias and out of the room, leaving Dean sitting there, pale and shaken. Dean, Elias said, you don't have to... Don't, Dean interrupted, his voice hollow. Just don't. He followed his brother out, leaving Elias alone with the documents and the growing certainty that he'd just made an enemy far more dangerous than he'd realized. Clara found him an hour later, still sitting in the study, staring at nothing. I heard raised voices, she said carefully. I confronted him, gave him a chance to make it right. Elias laughed bitterly. He threatened to burn the ranch down instead. Clara's face went pale. Elias, I know. I should have expected it. He rubbed his face, exhausted. But I had to try. Victor wouldn't have... His voice caught. He would have wanted me to try. Clara crossed to him, hesitated, then placed a hand on his shoulder. What are you going to do now? Find another way to pay the bank, keep the ranch running, hope Marcus was bluffing about... He stopped, looked up at her. What? Clara asked. He wasn't bluffing, Elias said slowly. That's the problem. Marcus doesn't bluff. He plans. Then we need to be ready, Clara said firmly. Whatever he's planning, we'll face it together. Elias looked at her, this woman who had every reason to stay invisible, stay safe, but who kept choosing to stand beside him anyway, and felt something shift in his chest. Gratitude, yes, but also something warmer, something that made the isolation feel a little less absolute. Thank you, he said quietly. She squeezed his shoulder once, then stepped back, propriety reasserting itself. I should get back to work. But Elias? Watch your back, please. I will. But neither of them knew that Marcus was already 3 steps ahead, and that the real danger wouldn't come from lawyers or banks or public scandal. It would come from the desert itself, from a ravine 20 miles from the estate, where accidents were easy to arrange and bodies hard to find. And it would come in less than a week. The warning came 3 days later, but not from any source Elias expected. He was in the north pasture, checking the fence line that separated Hale land from the unmarked wilderness beyond. The morning was cold, the kind of high desert chill that cut through clothes and settled in the bones. Ash moved beneath him with the easy gait of a horse that knew her rider's moods, her ears flicking back occasionally as if listening to his thoughts. He'd been out here since dawn, partly to inspect the fences and partly to think. The confrontation with Marcus had left him unsettled in ways he couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear. He'd lived with worse threats than anything Marcus could devise. It was the certainty in Marcus's eyes, the cold calculation that suggested plans already in motion. A rider appeared on the horizon, coming fast. Elias recognized the silhouette, Tom Brennan, one of the ranch hands who'd been with Victor since the beginning. Weathered and grizzled, Brennan was the kind of man who spoke rarely, but meant every word. "Mr. Hale," Brennan called as he approached, his horse lathered from the hard ride. "Need to talk to you. Private." Elias gestured him closer, away from the fence line where sound carried. "What's wrong?" Brennan glanced over his shoulder, a nervous gesture Elias had never seen from him before. "Last night, I was in town, having a drink at the saloon, heard Dean talking to a couple of drifters, rough types, not from around here. He was buying them drinks, getting them liquored up." "Dean does that most nights," Elias said, though unease was already building in his gut. "Not like this. He wasn't just buying drinks, he was asking questions about the ravines out past Eagle's Point, about which routes you take when you ride out to check the herds." Brennan's jaw tightened. "About accidents. How easy they are to arrange in rough country. But the cold that went through Elias had nothing to do with the morning air. "You're sure?" "I know what I heard, Mr. Hale, and I know what it means." Brennan's weathered face was grim. "They're planning something, and it ain't nothing good." Elias felt his hands tighten on the reins. "Did you see the men's faces? Would you recognize them?" "One of them, maybe. Had a scar across his cheek here." Brennan traced a line from temple to jaw. "The other kept his hat low, but they weren't cowhands, I can tell you that. They moved wrong, carried themselves like trouble." "Thank you for telling me." "That all you gonna say?" Brennan's voice rose slightly. "Mr. Hale, these men, they're talking about killing you." "I know." "Then what are you going to do about it?" It was a fair question. Elias could go to the sheriff, but with what proof? A ranch hand's second-hand account of overheard conversation in a saloon? Marcus and Dean would deny everything, and without evidence, it would be Elias's word against theirs, the foundling accusing the bloodline. He could already imagine how that would play out in town, how it would feed into the narrative Marcus had been building about his paranoia and unsuitability. "I'm going to be careful," Elias said finally, "and I'm going to ask you to do the same. Don't tell anyone else what you heard. If Marcus or Dean get wind that I know, they'll just change the plan," Brennan finished. "Move it up maybe, or find another way." He shook his head. "You're playing a dangerous game, Mr. Hale." "I didn't start it," Elias said quietly, "but I'll finish it." Brennan studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Victor knew what he was doing when he left you the ranch. Don't prove him wrong by getting yourself killed." He turned his horse and rode back toward the main compound, leaving Elias alone with the wind and his thoughts. That night, Clara noticed Elias had stopped eating. She was serving dinner in the main dining room, where Marcus sat at one end of the long table and Dean at the other, with Elias between them in what felt increasingly like a gauntlet. The conversation was stilted at best, venomous at worst. Tonight it was simply silent. Marcus focused on his meal with surgical precision, while Dean drank more than he ate. But Elias just pushed food around his plate, his mind clearly elsewhere. After the meal, Clara found him on the veranda, staring out at the darkening desert. She shouldn't approach him here where others might see, but something in his posture, the tension in his shoulders, the way he gripped the railing, pulled her forward. "You didn't eat," she said softly. He glanced at her, surprised, then back at the horizon. "Wasn't hungry." "That's not it." She moved closer, lowering her voice. "Something happened. What is it?" For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then quietly, he told her about Brennan's warning, about Dean and the drifters, and the conversation about ravines and accidents. Claire's blood ran cold. "You have to tell someone. The sheriff won't do anything without proof." "Then get proof. Have someone follow Dean, watch those men, and tip them off that I know?" Elias shook his head. "No. Right now they think they have the advantage of surprise. I need to keep it that way." "So what? You're just going to wait for them to try to kill you?" Her voice cracked slightly on the last words. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw the fear in her eyes. Not for herself, but for him. Something in his chest tightened. "I'm going to be smarter than they are," he said. "That's always been the only advantage I have." "Elias, I need you to do something for me," he interrupted. "If something happens, if I disappear, or there's an accident, I need you to go to Graves, the lawyer. I've left a sealed envelope in the bottom drawer of my desk. It has copies of all the evidence against Marcus, along with instructions. Make sure he gets it." "Don't talk like that." "Promise me, Clara." She wanted to refuse. Wanted to shake him and tell him this was insane, that he couldn't just walk into a trap even knowing it was there. But she saw the determination in his face, the same stubborn certainty that had carried him through years of being unwanted and underestimated. "I promise," she whispered. He nodded, then turned back to the desert. "They're going to make their move soon. Marcus is too impatient to wait long, so I'm going to give them an opportunity." "What?" "Tomorrow I'm riding out to Eagle's Point to check on the North Herd. It's isolated, rough terrain, exactly the kind of place where an accident would be believable." He paused. "And I'm going alone." Clara's hand shot out, gripping his arm. "That's suicide." "No, it's bait." His voice was calm, almost detached. "They'll expect me to be afraid, to change my routines, maybe stay close to the main house. If I do the opposite, if I give them exactly what they want, they'll take it. And when they do, I'll be ready." "Ready how? You're one man against however many they've hired." "I know that terrain better than anyone. I've ridden it for years. I know every canyon, every wash, every place where someone could wait in ambush." He met her eyes. "I won't be easy prey, Clara. I promise you that." She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that his knowledge and skill would be enough. But she'd seen what men were capable of when they wanted something badly enough. And what Marcus wanted was Elias gone. "Then I'm coming with you," she said. "Absolutely not. You can't stop me. I'll ride out after you if I have to, tell them I'm gathering herbs or checking the garden fences or whatever excuse they'll believe." Her grip on his arm tightened. "You said yourself you need someone to get that envelope to Graves if something happens." "Well, I'm making sure nothing happens." Elias stared at her, seeing the steel beneath the quiet exterior. He'd always known she was brave. Her warnings, her help with the ledgers, her willingness to stand with him had proven that. But this was different. This was walking into danger with eyes open, choosing to risk everything for someone who'd never asked for her protection. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why would you do this?" Clara held his gaze, and for just a moment she let him see past all the careful walls she'd built. "Because someone has to, and because—" She hesitated, then pushed forward. "Because you're a good man, Elias Hale. Maybe the only truly good one I've ever known. And I won't stand by and watch them destroy you." Well, something passed between them in that moment. An understanding, an acknowledgement of something neither was quite ready to name. Then Clara released his arm and stepped back, composure sliding back into place. "I'll be ready at dawn," she said. "Wear something warm. It's cold out past Eagle's Point." She disappeared into the house before he could argue further, leaving Elias alone with the night and the growing certainty that tomorrow would change everything. The morning came clear and cold, the sky that particular shade of blue that only exists in high desert country. Elias was in the stables before sunrise, saddling Ash and checking his gear with methodical precision. He packed light, water, dried meat, a knife, and his rifle. The Winchester had been Victor's, passed down with a quiet ceremony that had meant more to Elias than any words could have expressed. Clara appeared as he was tightening the cinch, dressed in practical riding clothes she must have borrowed from somewhere. Her face was pale but determined. "You're really doing this," Elias said. "We're really doing this," she corrected. He wanted to argue, to send her back to safety, but he could see it would be useless. So instead he helped her saddle one of the gentler mares, showing her how to check the stirrups and secure the bedroll. They rode out as the sun broke over the eastern peaks, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The ranch fell behind them, growing smaller until it was just a white smudge against the red earth. Neither of them saw Marcus watching from the study window, a thin smile on his face. Or Dean, already riding hard toward town with a message for two men who'd been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Eagles Point was a 3-hour ride north through increasingly rough country. The land rose in jagged steps, red rock giving way to sandstone formations that looked like ruined cathedrals. The north herd grazed in a high valley beyond the point, accessible only through a narrow canyon that twisted between sheer walls. It was beautiful country, and deadly if you didn't know it. They rode in silence for the first hour, both lost in their own thoughts. Then Clara spoke, her voice almost lost in the wind. "Tell me about the day you saved Victor's life, the first time." Elias glanced at her, surprised. "Why?" "Because I want to understand. How a 10-year-old boy knew how to stop bleeding and set a broken bone." He was quiet for a long moment, and Clara thought he wouldn't answer. Then he began to speak, his voice distant, as if describing someone else's life. "I was 6 when my mother died. Fever took her in 3 days. My father, I don't remember much about him. He left before I could walk." Elias kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "After she died, I was on my own. Too young to work, too small to steal anything worth having. I survived by being useful, fetching water, running messages, doing whatever people would pay pennies for." "How did you learn medicine?" "There was a doctor in one of the towns. I don't even remember which one anymore. He was drunk most of the time, but when he was sober, he was brilliant. I'd hang around his office, watching through the window. He caught me one day, figured I was going to rob him." A faint smile crossed Elias's face. "Instead, he taught me. Basic things at first, how to clean a wound, how to recognize infection, then more complex stuff. He said I had a gift for it, that I saw patterns other people missed." "What happened to him?" "He died. The drinking caught up with him." Elias's voice flattened. "After that, I drifted. Ended up in Redemption Springs a few months before I found Victor. And when I saw him dying in that wash," he shrugged. "It was just instinct. Do what needs doing." Clara absorbed this, understanding him better now. This man who'd survived by being useful, by never asking for anything, by enduring whatever the world threw at him with silent determination. No wonder he couldn't just walk away from the ranch, even with his life in danger. It was the first thing that had ever truly been his. "He was right, you know," she said. "Victor, you do have a gift for seeing patterns. Sometimes patterns aren't enough." "They are today," Clara said firmly. "Because you've thought this through, haven't you? You have a plan." Elias's lips quirked slightly. "Something like that?" They rode on, the sun climbing higher, the air warming as they descended into the canyon. The walls rose on either side, 50 feet of striated sandstone that turned the passage into a corridor of shadow and light. Water had carved this path over millennia, and in places the floor was still damp from the last rain, weeks ago. It was perfect ambush country. Elias slowed Ash to a walk, his eyes scanning the rim above. Clara followed his lead, her heart beginning to pound. Every shadow looked like a hiding place, every rock formation like a sniper's nest. They were halfway through the canyon when Elias saw it, fresh horse tracks in the damp sand coming from a side passage that branched off the main route. 2 horses, maybe 3. The tracks led deeper into the canyon, toward the narrowest point where the walls closed in and escape would be almost impossible. "Clara," he said quietly, "I need you to turn around, ride back to the ranch." "No." This isn't a discussion. A shot cracked through the canyon, echoing off the walls like thunder. Ash reared, screaming. Elias fought to control her, and in that moment of distraction, he didn't see the second shooter positioned on the opposite rim. The bullet took him high on the left side, spinning him half out of the saddle. He hit the ground hard, pain exploding through his ribs and shoulder. Blood, hot and slick, soaked through his shirt. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard Clara scream his name. More shots. The mare Clara was riding bolted, throwing her before disappearing back down the canyon. Clara scrambled toward Elias, her hands already reaching for him. "Don't!" he gasped. "Run!" But she ignored him, dragging him toward a jumble of boulders that offered minimal cover. Bullets kicked up sand around them, the shooters finding their range. Clara got him behind the rocks just as another shot sparked off stone inches from her head. Elias's vision was graying at the edges, shock setting in. He could hear voices now, echoing strangely in the canyon. 2 men, maybe 3, calling to each other as they positioned for the kill shot. "Mr. Hale?" One of the voices closer now. "Nothing personal, just business." Clara pressed her hands against the wound in Elias's side, trying to stop the bleeding. Her hands came away red, too much red. "Stay with me," she whispered urgently. "Elias, stay with me." His rifle had fallen when he'd been shot. She could see it, 10 feet away, completely exposed. Even if she could reach it, she didn't know how to use it. Didn't know if she could hit anything if she tried. They were trapped. Outgunned. And Elias was bleeding out in her arms. The footsteps grew closer, boots crunching on sand and gravel. The shooters were taking their time now, confident in their victory. "Come on out, Mr. Hale," the voice called. "Make this easy on everyone." Clara looked down at Elias. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and rapid. He was dying. Right here, right now, in this nameless canyon, and there was nothing she could do to stop it, except refuse. The word rose in her mind with crystalline clarity. Refuse to let him die. Refuse to let Marcus win. Refuse to surrender to the casual cruelty of men who thought power meant the freedom to destroy. She grabbed the rifle. The movement drew immediate fire. A bullet passed so close she felt the air displacement, but she was already moving, diving forward and rolling behind a different rock. Her hands found the rifle's mechanism. She'd seen Elias check it that morning, had watched how he loaded it. 1 shot. That's all she'd get before they triangulated her position and filled her new hiding spot with lead. She peered around the boulder, 2 men, advancing in formation, rifles raised. One had a scar across his cheek, the man Brennan had described. The other was younger, nervous, his movements twitchy. Clara aimed at the scarred man, the way she'd seen ranch hands target practice. Breath in, breath out. Squeeze, don't pull. The rifle bucked against her shoulder with brutal force. The shot went wide, missing by a foot. But the sound, the unexpected resistance, made both men dive for cover. In that moment of chaos, Elias moved. She hadn't seen him regain consciousness, hadn't seen him pull the knife from his boot or gather the strength to act. But suddenly he was up, moving with the desperate speed of a wounded animal, and before the scarred man could recover, Elias was on him. The fight was brief and brutal. Elias, half dead from blood loss, still had the advantage of surprise and proximity. The knife found the man's throat. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and red dust. The second shooter spun toward them, but Clara was already firing again. This shot hit, not the man, but his rifle, sending it spinning from his hands. He scrambled backward, eyes wide with panic. "Dean!" he shouted toward the canyon rim. "Dean, they're fighting back!" So Dean was here, watching from above while hired killers did his dirty work. The wounded shooter turned and ran, disappearing around a bend in the canyon. Moments later, Clara heard horses, at least 2, maybe 3, retreating at full gallop. Then silence. Clara dropped the rifle and ran to Elias. He was on his knees beside the dead man, covered in blood, his own and the shooter's. His face was white as bone, his breathing coming in harsh gasps. "I've got you!" Clara said, catching him as he swayed. "I've got you!" "Clara." His voice was barely a whisper. "Did they?" "They ran. You're safe. We're both safe." Her hands found the wound again, pressing hard despite his gasp of pain. But we need to get you help. You're losing too much blood. Can't go back to the ranch. His eyes struggled to focus. Marcus, he'll finish it. I know. Clara's mind raced. The main ranch was 3 hours away, and Elias would never survive the ride. But there were other options. The old line shack, the one near Copper Creek. How far? Mile. Maybe 2. Can you ride? He didn't answer, which was answer enough. Then we walk, Clara said. It took her 15 minutes to catch Ash. The mare had bolted, but not far, her training overriding her panic. Clara led her back to where Elias waited, using every ounce of strength to keep himself upright against a boulder. Getting him into the saddle was a nightmare of pain and determination. He couldn't lift his left arm, could barely stand. Clara had to physically shove him up while he used his good arm to grab the saddle horn. Once he was mounted, he slumped forward, barely conscious. Clara took Ash's reins and started walking. The journey to the line shack took 3 hours and felt like 3 days. The sun climbed to its zenith and began its descent. Elias drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes mumbling incoherently, sometimes going ominously silent. Twice Clara thought she'd lost him, had to stop and check for breath and pulse before she could convince herself to keep moving. The line shack appeared finally, a weathered structure of stone and timber that looked like it might collapse in the next strong wind. But it had a roof and walls and a door that Clara could bar from the inside. She got Elias down from the saddle through sheer desperation and adrenaline, half carrying him through the door and lowering him onto the single narrow cot. His shirt was soaked through with blood, the wound still seeping. Clara had never treated a gunshot before, had barely treated anything beyond minor cuts and burns. But she remembered what Elias had told her about the doctor who'd taught him. See the pattern, do what needs doing. She tore his shirt open. The bullet had entered high on his left side, above the lowest rib. Entry wound the size of her thumb, ugly and deep. She carefully rolled him onto his side, ignoring his groan of pain, and found the exit wound in his back, larger, more ragged, but at least the bullet had passed through. That was good. No digging for fragments, but the bleeding was bad. An infection would be worse. The shack had basic supplies, a first aid kit that Victor had insisted be stocked in every outbuilding, old but intact. Clara found clean cloth, carbolic acid, needle, and thread. Her hands shook as she laid everything out. She cleaned the wound first, pouring carbolic acid directly into the torn flesh. Elias convulsed, a scream tearing from his throat before he passed out completely. Clara kept working, swabbing away blood and debris, inspecting for damage. The bullet had missed major organs. A miracle. But it had clipped a rib and torn through muscle. Without proper medical attention, he'd still die, from blood loss, from infection, from shock. Clara threaded the needle with hands that had steadied now that she had a task to focus on. She'd sewn plenty of things in her life, clothes, linens, tears, and rips of all kinds. This wasn't so different, she told herself, just skin instead of fabric, life instead of cotton. She started to stitch. 20 minutes later, both wounds were closed, the stitches crude but functional. Clara bandaged him tightly, using the cleanest cloth she could find, then covered him with every blanket in the shack. Then she sat on the floor beside the cot, her back against the wall, and let herself shake. She'd killed a man today. Maybe 2. She didn't know if Elias's knife work had been fatal or if the scarred shooter had survived the canyon. She'd fired a weapon in anger, had fought for her life and Elias's life without hesitation, and she'd do it again, would do worse, if it meant keeping him alive. The realization should have horrified her. Instead, it just felt true. Elias woke at dusk, his eyes finding her immediately. Clara? She was at his side in an instant. I'm here. Don't move. You'll tear the stitches. You stitched me? Someone had to. She pressed the back of her hand to his forehead. Hot, but not dangerously so. Not yet. How do you feel? Like I've been shot. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. And stitched by someone who learned on pillowcases. I did my best. I know. His good hand found hers, squeezed weakly. You saved my life. Again. You saved mine first, in the canyon. Fair trade. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the wind outside. Then Elias spoke again, his voice rough with exhaustion and pain. "They'll think I'm dead." "I know. That's good. Gives us time." His eyes drifted closed. "Need to get to Graves. Need to—" "Rest first," Clara said firmly. "You're not going anywhere for at least a few days. Can't stay here. Not safe. Safer than the ranch. And I barred the door. No one's getting in without warning." She adjusted the blanket around him. "Sleep, Elias. I'll keep watch." He wanted to argue. She could see it in his face, but exhaustion and blood loss won the battle. His breathing deepened, evening out into the rhythm of sleep. Clara kept her vigil through the night, rifle across her lap, ears tuned to every sound outside. Once she heard horses in the distance, and her heart stopped, but they passed without slowing. Probably ranch hands from a neighboring spread or drifters moving through. Not Marcus's men. Not yet. As dawn began to gray the eastern sky, Clara allowed herself to think about what came next. They couldn't hide here forever. Eventually Marcus would search the canyon, would find the dead shooter, and realize Elias might have survived. He'd send more men, better men, and this time there'd be no warning. They needed to get back to civilization, to Graves, to people who could protect Elias and testify to what had happened. But Elias needed time to heal first, needed to be strong enough to ride and fight and face down his enemies. Time was the one thing they didn't have. Clara looked at Elias's sleeping face, saw the pain lines etched around his eyes, even in sleep, and made a decision. She would buy him that time, however she had to. When Elias woke again in full daylight, he found Clara had ventured out, risking exposure to hunt. She'd managed to snare a rabbit and had it roasting over a small fire built in the shack's stone fireplace. The smell made his stomach clench with hunger he hadn't realized he felt. "You shouldn't have gone out," he said. "You need food. Protein helps healing." She turned the rabbit, not looking at him. "How's the pain?" "Manageable." "You're lying." "Yes." Despite everything, that made her smile. She brought him water first, helping him sit up enough to drink without choking. Then small pieces of rabbit, watching to make sure he could keep it down. "There's a problem," Clara said after he'd eaten. "We've been missing for over a day now. The ranch hands will have noticed. Someone will have gone looking." "Good. Let them find the canyon. Let them find the body." Elias's voice was hard. "Let Marcus think he won." "And when they don't find our bodies? When there's no sign of you or me? They'll assume we fell in the river, got dragged downstream. It happens." He met her eyes. "How long do you think we have before Marcus consolidates power?" Clara considered. "With you dead, he's the oldest surviving Hale. The will would be contested, probably overturned. He'd claim the ranch within a week, maybe less. Then we have less than a week to prove I'm alive and expose what he did. You can't even stand." "I will," Elias said with absolute certainty. "Give me 2 days, 3 at most. That's not enough time to heal. It'll have to be." The next 2 days passed in a fever dream of pain and stubbornness. Elias forced himself to move, to walk the length of the shack despite the agony it caused. Clara changed his bandages twice daily, watched for signs of infection, and argued with him every time he pushed himself beyond what was safe. On the 3rd day, riders appeared. Clara saw them from the window, 3 men on horseback, moving slowly across the scrubland toward the shack. They wore ranch hand clothes, but something about them was wrong. The way they sat their saddles, the way they spread out in formation. "Elias," she whispered urgently. "Company." He was up immediately, moving to the window despite the pain that lanced through his side. He studied the riders, his face grim. "Not ours," he said. "Marcus's men. How did they find us?" "Someone talked, or they're checking every possible hiding place." He turned from the window, his mind racing. "How many rounds in the rifle?" 4, maybe 5. "Not enough for 3 men." He looked around the shack. 1 room, 1 door, 2 windows. "No back exit?" "None." They were trapped. 3 armed men outside, limited ammunition, and Elias barely able to fight. The odds were catastrophic, unless they changed the game. "Help me outside," Elias said suddenly. "What?" "Trust me." Clara didn't understand, but she didn't argue. She got him to the door, helped him bar it from the outside, then supported him as they moved around to the side of the shack where the horses couldn't see them. The riders reached the front door. Clara could hear their voices, muffled by the walls. "Anyone in there? We're from the Hale Ranch, looking for survivors from the canyon incident." Silence from inside the shack, as expected. "We're coming in." The sound of boots on the step, the door rattling against the bar. Then Elias stepped around the corner, rifle raised despite the way his hand shook, and said quietly, "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The three men froze. The one in front, a hard-faced man with cold eyes, slowly raised his hands. "Mr. Hale, we thought you were dead." "Clearly I'm not. Marcus sent us to find you, bring you back safe." "Marcus sent you to finish what his other hired guns couldn't." Elias kept the rifle steady. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to turn around, ride back to the ranch, and tell Marcus I'm alive. Tell him I'm coming, and tell him when I do, I'm bringing evidence that will hang him." The lead man's expression didn't change. "That's a lot of faith in a man who can barely stand. And you're showing a lot of nerve for someone in my sights." The standoff held for 3 heartbeats. Then the lead man smiled, thin and cold. "Have it your way, Mr. Hale, but you should know, Marcus has already filed papers claiming you're dead. The ranch is his, and come tomorrow, there won't be anything left for you to inherit." He turned his horse, the others following. They rode away at a leisurely pace, confident and unhurried. As soon as they were out of sight, Elias collapsed. Clara caught him, lowering him to the ground. "Why did you let them go?" she gasped. "They'll tell Marcus." "Exactly." Elias's breathing was labored, his face gray with pain and exhaustion. "Let Marcus think he's won. Let him get comfortable, and then—" He coughed, tasted blood. "Then we strike. You need a doctor. I need Graves, and I need to get to town before Marcus locks down his claim." He gripped her arm. "Help me up. We're leaving, now." "You'll die." "Then I'll die on my feet," Elias said. "Fighting, not hiding." Clara looked at him, this impossible, stubborn man who'd survived the desert and poverty and years of hatred, and knew there was no arguing with him. "All right," she said, "but I'm getting you to town my way." She fashioned a travois from branches and blankets, tied it to Ash's saddle, and loaded Elias onto it over his protests. Then she mounted the mare and started riding. Not toward the ranch, not toward the law, toward town. Toward graves and witnesses, and the last chance they had to reclaim what had been stolen. As they moved across the desert, the sun beginning its descent toward the western peaks, neither of them saw the figure watching from a distant ridge. Dean Hale, his horse lathered from hard riding, his eyes fixed on their retreating forms. He turned and spurred toward the ranch, carrying the message that would set everything in motion. The dead had risen, and the war was about to begin. The journey to Redemption Springs took 6 hours that felt like 6 days. Clara pushed Ash as hard as she dared, but with Elias on the travois, they couldn't risk more than a steady walk over the roughest terrain. Every jolt made him gasp. Every bump threatened to tear open the stitches she'd so carefully placed. She kept glancing back, expecting to see riders on the horizon, Marcus's men coming to finish what they'd started. But the desert remained empty, just red earth and blue sky and the relentless sun beating down. Elias drifted in and out of consciousness, his fever climbing despite Claire's attempts to keep him cool with water from her canteen. In his lucid moments, he talked, fragmented instructions about the evidence, about Graves, about what needed to happen when they reached town. "The envelope," he murmured. "In my desk. Did you get it?" "I told you I couldn't go back to the ranch," Clara said, keeping her voice steady. "But I remember everything you found. The contracts, the payment records, all of it. I can testify." "Not enough. Need proof. Documents. Then we'll get them. But first we get you to a doctor." "No doctor. Graves first." "Elias, Marcus will have people watching. Doctor's office, the hotel, anywhere obvious." His eyes opened, struggling to focus. "Graves's office. Above the bank. Back entrance through the alley. He lives there. Works late most nights." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that staying alive mattered more than legal strategy, but she understood what drove him. This wasn't about survival anymore. It was about justice, about proving that Marcus's cruelty wouldn't win, that Victor's faith hadn't been misplaced. "All right," she said quietly. "Graves first, then the doctor. Then the courthouse," Elias added, his voice fading. "Tomorrow." Before Marcus files, he passed out before finishing the sentence. They reached Redemption Springs as twilight bled the color from the sky. The town had grown since Elias had last been here, new buildings sprouting along the main street like weeds after rain. But the core remained the same: the saloon, the general store, the bank with its second-story offices. Clara guided Ash into the alley behind the bank, her heart hammering. The street was busy with evening traffic, cowhands coming in from the range, merchants closing up shop. No one paid attention to a woman on a tired horse dragging what looked like a load of supplies. She tied Ash to a post and moved to the travois. Elias was unconscious, his breathing shallow and rapid. His skin burned under her hand, and the bandages showed fresh blood seepage. They were running out of time. The back stairs to Graves's office were narrow and steep. Clara looked at them, looked at Elias's dead weight, and felt despair claw at her throat. She couldn't carry him up there. Couldn't drag him. Couldn't... A door opened at the top of the stairs. A thin figure appeared, silhouetted against lamplight. "Who's there?" Graves's voice sharp with suspicion. "It's Clara, from the Hale Ranch," her voice cracked. "Please, I need help." Graves descended the stairs quickly, his eyes widening when he saw Elias on the travois. "My word, is he alive?" "Barely." Claire's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her face. "They tried to kill him, shot him in the canyon and left him for dead. I got him out, but he needs a doctor, and we can't go to the regular physician because Marcus has people watching and—" "Slow down," Graves said, his lawyer's calm reasserting itself. "Let me help you get him upstairs. Then you can tell me everything." Between them, they managed to maneuver Elias up the stairs and into Graves's office. The lawyer cleared his desk with one sweep of his arm, sending papers scattering, and they laid Elias down on the polished wood. Graves examined him with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd seen gunshot wounds before. This was Arizona territory, after all, where violence was as common as dust. He peeled back the bandages, inspected Clara's stitchwork, and let out a low whistle. "Who did this?" "I did." Graves looked at her with new respect. "You probably saved his life. The stitching's crude, but it held, and you packed it clean." He pressed gently around the wound, checking for infection. "He's fevered, though, needs antibiotics, bed rest, proper care. Can you get a doctor, someone Marcus doesn't own?" "Dr. Chen, she's new to town, set up practice 3 months ago. Chinese woman trained in San Francisco. She doesn't owe the Hales anything." Graves moved to the window, checking the street below. "I'll send my clerk to fetch her, quietly." While they waited, Clara told him everything. The confrontation with Marcus, the theft from the ranch accounts, the overheard conversation about hiring killers, the ambush in the canyon, the 3 days hiding in the line shack. She spoke quickly and precisely, every detail sharp in her memory. Graves listened without interruption, his face growing grimmer with each revelation. When she finished, he sat down heavily in his chair. "This is worse than I thought," he said. "Marcus filed a petition this morning claiming Elias died in a riding accident. He had witnesses, 2 ranch hands who supposedly found blood and signs of struggle in the canyon. He's requesting emergency administration of the estate pending formal death certification." "But Elias is alive, which will prove." But Marcus has been very clever about this. He's created a paper trail, witnesses, a narrative that paints him as the grieving brother trying to preserve the family legacy. Graves tapped his fingers on the desk. "If we're going to counter this, we need more than testimony. We need the evidence Elias mentioned. The documents proving Marcus's theft. They're in Elias's desk at the ranch, which is now under Marcus's control. He'll have destroyed anything incriminating by now." Clara felt hope guttering. "Then what do we do?" "We prove attempted murder." Graves's eyes sharpened. "You said there was a body in the canyon, the man Elias killed in self-defense." "Yes, and the other shooter ran, but I don't know if he'd testify." "He won't need to, because that body is evidence. If we can connect him to Marcus or Dean, if we can prove he was a hired killer." Graves stood, pacing now. "We need the sheriff involved. Need to get a party out to the canyon before Marcus can clean it up. The sheriff is in Marcus's pocket, Clara said bitterly. Everyone knows it. Sheriff Taylor is pragmatic. He follows money and power. Right now, Marcus has both. Graves paused. But if we can shift that balance, even slightly, Taylor will shift with it. A knock at the door interrupted them. Graves opened it to reveal a small, severe-looking woman carrying a medical bag. Dr. Chen entered without preamble, her eyes going immediately to Elias. Gunshot wound? Yes, Clara said. Dr. Chen set down her bag and began examining Elias with quick, competent hands. She checked his pulse, his pupils, listened to his breathing, then she started removing Clara's bandages. The bullet passed through? Yes. Good. Exit wound is messy but clean. Who stitched him? I did, Clara said, bracing for criticism. Dr. Chen looked at her, something like approval in her dark eyes. You did well. Very well, considering. The infection is mild, could be much worse. I'll give him sulfa powder, clean and rebandage the wound, and he should recover. She paused. But he needs rest, real rest, not whatever you've been putting him through. How long before he can travel? Appear in court? Dr. Chen frowned. A week at minimum, preferably 2. We don't have a week, Graves said. Then you'd better hope he's as stubborn as he looks. Dr. Chen began unpacking her supplies. I'll do what I can, but I'm a doctor, not a miracle worker. She worked quickly, cleaning the wound with iodine that made Elias gasp and arch despite his unconscious state, then applying sulfa powder and fresh bandages. She gave Clara a bottle of pills and strict instructions about dosage and signs of complications. Keep him quiet, keep him hydrated, and change the dressings twice daily, Dr. Chen said. And if the fever doesn't break by morning, send for me immediately. She left as abruptly as she'd arrived, refusing payment with a curt shake of her head. Clara watched her go, grateful beyond words. We'll keep him here tonight, Graves said. My quarters are upstairs. Not comfortable, but private. You should rest too. You look half dead yourself. I'm fine. You're running on fumes and stubbornness. Graves's voice softened. You've done everything you can for now. Let me take the next watch. I'll wake you if anything changes. Clara wanted to refuse, wanted to stay beside Elias every moment, but exhaustion was catching up with her, the adrenaline that had sustained her for 3 days finally burning out. She nodded reluctantly and let Graves show her to a small room with a narrow bed. She meant to stay awake, to listen for any sound from the room where Elias lay. But the moment her head touched the pillow, sleep pulled her under like dark water. She woke to voices, low and urgent. Dawn light filtered through the window, and for a moment Clara couldn't remember where she was. Then memory crashed back and she bolted upright. The voices were coming from Graves's office. She hurried there to find Elias sitting up, pale and hollow-eyed but conscious, arguing with the lawyer. Don't care what the doctor said. I need to be there. Elias, Graves said firmly, you can barely sit upright. Appearing in court in this condition will only make you look weak, desperate. I need to look alive, Elias interrupted. That's all that matters. He saw Clara in the doorway and his expression shifted, relief mixed with something deeper. You're all right. You're the one who was shot, she said, moving to his side. How do you feel? Like I've been shot. He tried for a smile, managed only a grimace. But conscious, that's progress. The fever broke an hour ago, Graves said. Which is miraculous, considering, but that doesn't mean he's ready to face Marcus in court. When is the hearing? Clara asked. This morning, 10 o'clock. Marcus is petitioning for emergency estate administration before Judge Morrison. Graves checked his pocket watch. Which gives us 3 hours. Then we have 3 hours to prepare, Elias said. He swung his legs off the desk, gritting his teeth against the pain, and stood. He swayed immediately, would have fallen if Clara hadn't caught him. This is insane, she said. This is necessary. He gripped her shoulder, steadying himself. Marcus thinks I'm dead. When I walk into that courtroom alive, it's going to shatter his entire strategy. We use that shock, that moment of confusion, to force his hand. And if he has you arrested? Graves asked. He could claim you faked your death, abandoned your legal responsibilities, anything to turn this around. Then you counter with attempted murder. With the evidence from the canyon. Elias met the lawyer's eyes. You said we need to shift the balance. This shifts it. Everything else follows. Graves studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but we do this my way. You don't speak unless I tell you to. You don't react no matter what Marcus says. You sit there and let me handle the legal maneuvering. Agreed. And we need more than just your presence. We need leverage. Graves began pacing again, his mind working through possibilities. Clara, you said Marcus had witnesses who claimed to find evidence of Elias's death in the canyon. If we can prove those witnesses are lying, or better yet, that they're the ones who tried to kill him. Tom Brennan, Clara said suddenly. He's the one who warned Elias about the plot. He heard Dean hiring those men. If we can get him to testify. He's still at the ranch, Elias said, under Marcus's control. Not necessarily. Graves moved to the window, thinking. The hands come to town every Saturday for supplies. If Brennan's among them, if we can intercept him before Marcus knows we're making a move. Today's Saturday, Clara said. Then we move fast. Graves turned back to them, his expression hardening into something that looked almost predatory. Here's what we do. Clara, you go to the general store. The supply wagon usually arrives around 8. Find Brennan, tell him what's happening, see if he'll testify. Don't approach anyone else. We can't risk word getting back to Marcus. What about the body in the canyon? Elias asked. I'll send word to Sheriff Taylor that there's evidence of a crime at Eagles Point. If he's even halfway competent, he'll have to investigate. Graves paused. And Elias, you're going to stay here, out of sight, until we walk into that courthouse. The element of surprise is the only advantage we have. Clara and Graves left together, descending the back stairs into an alley already warming with morning sun. They separated at the corner, Graves heading toward the sheriff's office, Clara toward the general store on the opposite end of town. The store was already busy, farmers and ranchers stocking up for the week ahead. Clara spotted the Hale Ranch wagon outside, recognized the old mare hitched to it. Her heart began to race. She found Brennan inside, examining a new harness. When he saw her, his weathered face went slack with shock. Miss Clara? We thought you were dead, Clara finished quietly. I know. We need to talk, somewhere private. Brennan glanced around nervously, then nodded toward the back room where the store kept bulk supplies. They slipped inside and Clara quickly told him everything, the ambush, Elias's survival, the hearing scheduled for that morning. They're trying to steal the ranch, she said urgently, and unless you testify about what you heard Dean say, Marcus is going to succeed. Brennan's jaw worked. If I testify against the Hales, I'll never work in this territory again. Marcus will make sure of it. And if you don't, an innocent man loses everything. Clara met his eyes. I know what I'm asking, but Elias saved Victor's life once. He's earned the right to fight for his own. Brennan looked away, conflict written across his weathered features. Then he sighed heavily. Victor was a good man, best I ever worked for, and he chose Elias for a reason. He nodded. I'll testify. Tell me where and when. Relief flooded through Clara. The courthouse, 10 o'clock. And Tom, thank you. Don't thank me yet. This is going to get ugly. He was right, Clara realized as she hurried back to Graves's office. This would shatter what remained of the Hale family, would expose their dirty secrets to the entire territory. But sometimes things had to break completely before they could be rebuilt right. She found Elias dressed in a clean suit that Graves had somehow procured, probably from his own wardrobe, given the slightly too loose fit. His face was still pale, his movements careful, but determination burned in his dark eyes. Brennan will testify, Clara said. Elias closed his eyes briefly. That's good. That's really good. The sheriff agreed to send deputies to the canyon, Graves added. Reluctantly, but he agreed. If they find what we think they'll find, they will, Elias said with certainty. At 9:45, the three of them made their way to the courthouse. It was a substantial building for a frontier town, 2 stories of red brick with tall windows and a bell tower. People were already gathering on the steps, drawn by word that something significant was happening with the Hale estate. Graves led them through a side entrance, avoiding the crowd. They waited in a small antechamber just off the main courtroom, listening to the murmur of voices beyond the door. They're here, Graves said quietly, peering through a crack in the door. Marcus and Dean sitting at the plaintiff's table looking very confident. Half the town's here too. News travels fast. Elias stood, ignoring the way his side screamed in protest. Then let's not keep them waiting. The courthouse doors opened at precisely 10 o'clock. Judge Morrison entered, a severe man with iron gray hair and a reputation for fairness, and took his seat at the bench. The bailiff called for order and the courtroom settled into expectant silence. We are here, Morrison began, to consider the petition of Marcus Hale for emergency administration of the Hale estate, following the alleged death of his brother Elias Hale in a riding accident. Mr. Graves, I understand you represent the estate's interests. I do, Your Honor. Graves stood. And I have evidence that will demonstrate this petition is not only premature, it's fraudulent. Marcus shot to his feet. That's a serious accusation. Sit down, Mr. Hale, Morrison said sharply. You'll have your turn. Mr. Graves, present your evidence. I call Clara Thompson to the stand. Clara walked forward on trembling legs, was sworn in, and took the witness seat. Graves approached her with calm professionalism. Miss Thompson, you work at the Hale Ranch, correct? Yes, sir. As a housemaid. And were you present when Elias Hale allegedly died in this riding accident? I was with him, yes, sir. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Marcus's face went rigid. Please tell the court what happened. Clara took a breath and began. She described the ambush in the canyon, the shooters waiting in position, the gunshot that had nearly killed Elias. She testified about the 3 days in the line shack, about Marcus's men finding them and delivering their message. The courtroom was utterly silent by the time she finished. Thank you, Miss Thompson, Graves said. I call Thomas Brennan to the stand. Brennan came forward, looking uncomfortable in his best clothes, but his testimony was clear and damning. He described overhearing Dean hire 2 drifters, the conversation about accidents and ravines, the payment he'd seen change hands. Marcus was whispering urgently to his own lawyer now, his confident facade cracking. And finally, Your Honor, Graves said, I call my last witness, Elias Hale. The courtroom erupted. Marcus stood so fast his chair fell backward. That's impossible. Dean was on his feet too, his face white as chalk. He's dead. We saw the blood. Order! Morrison's gavel cracked like thunder. Order in this court! The side door opened, and Elias walked in. The effect was electric. People gasped, surged forward. A few actually screamed. Elias moved slowly, each step obviously painful, but he walked under his own power to the witness stand. Marcus just stared, all color draining from his face. For the first time since Claire had known him, he looked genuinely afraid. Elias was sworn in and took his seat, his eyes never leaving Marcus. Mr. Hale, Graves said formally, are you deceased? Not yet. Scattered, nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. And were you present in Eagles Point Canyon 5 days ago when you were allegedly killed in a riding accident? I was present when 2 hired gunmen attempted to murder me, yes. Can you identify who hired those men? Elias looked directly at Dean, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. My brother Dean arranged it, on Marcus's orders. Objection. Marcus's lawyer was on his feet. This is pure speculation. Is it? Graves turned to the judge. Your Honor, I have just received word from Sheriff Taylor. His deputies have returned from Eagles Point Canyon with the body of a man killed during the attack on Elias Hale. They also recovered evidence, including a receipt for payment signed by Dean Hale and a letter from Marcus Hale authorizing said payment for ranch security services. The courtroom exploded again. Morrison's gavel worked overtime, but nothing could contain the chaos now. Clara saw Marcus grab his lawyer's arm, saw Dean bolt for the door only to be intercepted by the bailiff. Furthermore, Graves continued, raising his voice over the din, I have documentation proving that Marcus Hale has systematically embezzled funds from the Hale Ranch over the past 3 years, totaling approximately $30,000. Documentation that was provided to me by Elias Hale prior to the alleged accident. That's a lie, Marcus shouted. We have the contracts, Mr. Hale, the receipts, the bank records. Graves's voice was cold and precise. We have everything. Marcus looked at Elias then, and the hatred in his eyes was pure and terrible. You planned this. All of it. The confrontation, the canyon, playing dead. You manipulated. I survived, Elias said quietly. That's all. I survived what you tried to do to me. Your Honor, Graves said, I move for immediate dismissal of Marcus Hale's petition, and I further request that criminal charges be filed against both Marcus and Dean Hale for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and embezzlement. Morrison looked at Marcus, at Dean, at Elias sitting pale and wounded in the witness stand. Then he nodded slowly. Petition dismissed. Bailiff, take both Marcus and Dean Hale into custody pending formal charges. He turned to Elias. Mr. Hale, the estate remains under your control as specified in Victor Hale's will. This court finds no evidence of death, incompetence, or any other disqualifying factor. The gavel came down one final time. Marcus and Dean were led away in handcuffs, Marcus silent and seething, Dean openly weeping. The courtroom gradually emptied, people spilling out into the street to spread the news. Within hours, it would be all over the territory. The attempted murder, the embezzlement, the dramatic resurrection in court. Clara found Elias still sitting in the witness stand, looking exhausted beyond measure. She moved to his side, offered her hand. He took it, let her help him stand. Is it over? She asked quietly. The legal part, maybe. Elias looked toward the door where Marcus had disappeared. The rest? We'll see. Graves approached them, satisfaction evident in his usually stern face. That was extraordinary, risky, dramatic, and highly irregular, but extraordinary. Thank you, Elias said, for everything. Thank Miss Thompson. She's the one who kept you alive long enough to make this happen. Graves paused. The trial will take months. Marcus has resources, connections. He'll fight this every step of the way. Let him fight, Elias said. I'm not running anymore. They left the courthouse through the front doors this time, walking out into brilliant morning sunshine. A crowd had gathered, people staring and whispering. But there were also nods of approval, a few muttered words of support. Tom Brennan pushed through the crowd, his weathered face creased with concern. Mr. Hale, the wagon's here if you need transport back to the ranch. Elias looked at Clara, a question in his eyes. She nodded. Thank you, Tom, Elias said. I think it's time to go home. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, Elias resting against supply sacks in the wagon bed while Clara sat beside him. The sun climbed toward noon, warming the desert air, and for the first time in days, the tension that had been coiled tight in Clara's chest began to ease. What are you thinking? She asked. Elias opened his eyes, looked at her. That I'm grateful, that I'm tired, that I don't know what happens next. You rebuild, Clara said simply. The ranch, the reputation, everything Marcus damaged. You do what Victor trusted you to do. And you? Elias asked quietly. What happens to you? Clara considered the question. She could go back to being invisible, back to her role as housemaid, pretending the last week hadn't happened, or she could choose something different. I help you, she said. If you'll have me. Not as a servant, as... She hesitated, searching for the right word. A partner, Elias finished. Someone I trust absolutely. The way he looked at her made Clara's breath catch. There was something in his eyes beyond gratitude, beyond friendship, something that had been building through gunfire and fever and desperate escapes. A partner, she agreed softly. The ranch appeared on the horizon, the white stone house gleaming in the sun. Home, Clara thought. Not just for Elias anymore. For both of them. As Brennan guided the wagon through the gates, ranch hands emerged from the stables and bunkhouses, drawn by the commotion. They saw Elias in the wagon bed, saw Clara beside him, and understanding rippled through their ranks. Their boss had returned. Bloodied but unbroken. And the ranch was his again. Brennan helped Elias down from the wagon while Clara gathered the medical supplies Dr. Chen had sent along. Together, they made their way toward the main house, toward the future that was no longer just survival, but possibility. Behind them, the desert stretched vast and unforgiving. But for the first time, Elias Hale didn't feel like he was fighting it alone. He had an ally, a witness, a partner who dragged him back from death and refused to let him fall. And that, he realized, was worth more than any empire. The main house felt different when Elias walked through the doors. It was still the same structure, the high ceilings, the imported rugs, the paintings Victor had collected over decades. But the weight that had pressed down on Elias since the day he'd first entered as a 13-year-old boy was gone. This wasn't someone else's house anymore, granted through charity and conditional on good behavior. This was his, earned through blood and survival, and refusing to break when breaking would have been easier. Clara helped him up the stairs to his room, ignoring his protests that he could manage. Dr. Chen had been explicit: rest, minimal movement, no stress. The irony wasn't lost on either of them, given what they'd just been through. "You need to sleep," Claire said, helping him ease onto the bed. Real sleep, in a real bed, not half-conscious on a travois or a line shack cot. "There's too much to do," Elias said, but exhaustion was already pulling at him. "The ranch hands need direction, the accounts need reviewing, and the bank will wait until tomorrow, or the day after." Claire removed his boots, pulled a blanket over him. "The ranch survived without you for a week. It can survive another day while you heal." He wanted to argue, but his body had other ideas. The moment his head hit the pillow, sleep dragged him under like a riptide. Clara stood watching him for a moment, this impossible man who'd survived things that should have killed him a dozen times over. Then she quietly left the room, closing the door behind her. She found the household staff gathered in the kitchen, their faces a mixture of shock, relief, and uncertainty. The cook, Mrs. Patterson, was the first to speak. "Is it true? What they're saying in town about Marcus and Dean?" "It's true," Claire said quietly. "They tried to have Mr. Hale killed. They've been arrested." Silence absorbed the words. Then old Samuel, who had worked the stables since before Elias arrived, shook his head slowly. "Always knew those boys were no good. All of Victor's ambition with none of his character." He looked at Clara. "How is Mr. Hale?" "Recovering. He'll be fine." Clara straightened her shoulders. "But things are going to change around here. Mr. Hale is in charge now, truly in charge, without anyone undermining him. And we're going to run this ranch the way Victor intended. Fair, honest, right." She saw understanding dawn on their faces. For years, they'd watched Elias endure Marcus's cruelty and Dean's contempt. They'd seen him work harder than anyone, ask for nothing, and somehow maintain his dignity through it all. And now, finally, justice had caught up with injustice. "What do you need from us?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "Your loyalty," Clara said simply, "and your discretion. There will be a trial. People will talk, ask questions, try to pry into family business. We protect Mr. Hale's privacy. We do our jobs. We make this ranch thrive." Nods all around. These were good people, Clara realized. They'd stayed through Victor's death and Marcus's brief reign because they believed in the land, the work, the legacy. Now they had a leader worth following. "And Miss Clara," Samuel said, "what's your role in all this?" It was a fair question. She was still technically a housemaid, though the events of the past week had obliterated any pretense of her staying in that position. "I'm whatever Mr. Hale needs me to be," Clara said. "Partner, administrator, friend." She met their gazes steadily. "And anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with him directly." No one had a problem with it. Elias slept for 16 hours straight, waking finally to afternoon light slanting through his windows, and the smell of food that made his stomach clench with hunger. Clara appeared moments later, as if she'd been listening for signs of consciousness, carrying a tray laden with soup, bread, and tea. "You're supposed to be resting," she said, setting the tray on the bedside table. "I am resting. Sitting up counts as resting." He reached for the soup, his movements still careful but stronger than they'd been. "What's happened while I was unconscious?" "Tom Brennan's been managing the day-to-day. The hands are loyal. They've made that clear. The bank sent a representative asking about the loan payment." Elias paused mid-spoonful. "What did you tell them?" "That you'd address it when you were well enough to conduct business. Which is not today," she added firmly. "The payment's due in 3 weeks. And you'll make it. We'll figure out how." Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her expression softening. "Elias, you just survived being shot, dragged across the desert, and exposed a murder plot in court. You're allowed to take a breath." He looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something shift in his chest, This woman who'd risked everything to save him, who'd faced down killers and testified in front of the entire town, was telling him it was okay to be human, to need help, to not carry everything alone. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for all of it. I know I haven't said it properly. You don't need to." "Yes, I do." He set down the soup, met her eyes. "You could have stayed safe, could have let me ride to Eagles Point alone, could have run when the shooting started, but you didn't. You chose to stand with me even when it meant facing death. Why?" Clara was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. "Because I've spent my whole life being invisible, being overlooked, and you saw me, not as a servant or a convenience, but as a person, someone worth trusting with your secrets, your evidence, your life." She paused. "And because you're the first good thing I've seen in a very long time. I wasn't going to let Marcus destroy that." The air between them felt charged with something neither was quite ready to name. Then Clara stood, breaking the moment with practiced efficiency. "Finish your soup. Dr. Chen will be here within the hour to check your wound." She was gone before Elias could respond, leaving him alone with his thoughts, and the growing realization that his feelings for Clara had deepened into something far beyond gratitude or partnership. Dr. Chen's examination was thorough and professional. She removed the bandages, inspected the wound with critical eyes, and pronounced him healing better than expected. "The stitches can come out in another week," she said, applying fresh bandages. "But you need to take it easy. No riding, no heavy lifting, no stress." "I run a 15,000-acre ranch," Elias said dryly. "Stress is built into the job description." "Then delegate. That's what employees are for." Dr. Chen packed her instruments with brisk efficiency. "You're young and strong, Mr. Hale. Your body will heal if you let it, but push too hard too soon and you'll do permanent damage." After she left, Elias found himself facing a reality he'd never had to navigate before, trusting other people to handle the ranch. For years, he'd done everything himself, partly from necessity and partly from the belief that he had to prove his worth through constant work. But Clara was right. He couldn't do this alone anymore. He called for Tom Brennan. The old ranch hand arrived within minutes, hat in hand, his weathered face cautious. "Mr. Hale, glad to see you up." "Sit down, Tom." Elias gestured to the chair beside his bed. "I need your help." Brennan sat, looking uncomfortable with the informality. "Whatever you need, sir. I need you to be my foreman, officially. Managing the day-to-day operations, coordinating with the hands, handling the cattle rotations." Elias saw surprise flicker across Brennan's face. "You know this land better than anyone except maybe me. The men respect you, and I trust you. That's worth more than experience or credentials." "Mr. Hale, I'm honored, but I'm just a cowhand. You're the man who warned me about Marcus's plot, even though it put your job at risk. You're the man who testified in court when it would have been safer to stay silent." Elias leaned forward. "I need people I can trust, Tom. People who'll do the right thing even when it's hard. Will you do this?" Brennan was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll do it, and I'll do it right. I promise you that. I know you will." They spent the next hour going over the ranch operations, which pastures needed rotation, which fences needed mending, which hands were reliable, and which were just marking time. Brennan had a sharp eye for detail and a deep understanding of the land's rhythms. By the time he left, Elias felt some of the weight on his shoulders ease. Clara was waiting when Brennan departed, a knowing look on her face. "Learning to delegate?" "Trying to." Elias shifted on the bed, wincing slightly. "What about you? Are you ready to take on more responsibility?" "What did you have in mind?" "The accounts, the contracts, the business side of the ranch that Marcus was handling, or mishandling." He watched her carefully. "You have a head for numbers. You proved that when you helped me audit the books. I need someone managing the finances who I can trust absolutely." Clara's eyes widened. "Elias, I'm a housemaid. I don't have formal training." "Neither did I when Victor took me in. You learn by doing." He paused. "Unless you'd prefer to stay in your current position?" "No," Clara said quickly. I just... Are you sure? People will talk. A woman managing a ranch's finances? Let them talk. Elias's voice was firm. This is my ranch. I decide who works where and in what capacity. And I'm deciding you're exactly the person I need. She studied him for a long moment, then smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her plain features into something almost beautiful. Then I accept. When do I start? Tomorrow. We'll go through the accounts together, and you can start organizing everything Marcus left in chaos. It became their routine over the following weeks. Each morning, after Dr. Chen's increasingly satisfied examinations, Elias and Clara would spend hours in the study going through ledgers, contracts, and correspondence. She absorbed information like a sponge, asked sharp questions, and caught errors that Elias had missed. Within a fortnight, she knew the ranch's financial situation as well as he did. The news from town arrived in fragments carried by Brennan and the other hands who made supply runs. Marcus and Dean were being held pending trial, which had been scheduled for late summer. Marcus had hired an expensive lawyer from Phoenix, was preparing a vigorous defense based on lack of evidence and witness credibility. Dean, meanwhile, had apparently broken down completely, spending his days in his cell weeping and claiming he'd only done what Marcus told him. They're saying Marcus might walk, Brennan reported one evening. His lawyer's good, real good, and without the physical evidence, the receipts, the contracts proving the embezzlement, it's mostly testimony against him. Elias absorbed this news with frustration. The documents Marcus had signed were gone, destroyed after Elias's confrontation. All they had left were Clara's testimony about what she'd seen in the ledgers and Brennan's account of what he'd overheard. In a court of law, that might not be enough to convict. Then we find more evidence, Clara said quietly. There has to be something. Men like Marcus don't hide their tracks perfectly. They're too arrogant. Where would we even look? Elias asked. We've been through everything here. Not everything. Clara's eyes sharpened. Marcus had an office in town, above the land registry. He spent time there when he was handling the so-called business expansion. If he kept any records, the sheriff would have searched it after his arrest. Would he? Marcus and Taylor were friendly, and Taylor's been awfully quiet about this whole situation. Clara stood, pacing now. What if we search it ourselves? Break into a locked office in the middle of town? Elias raised an eyebrow. You've developed a taste for crime. I've developed a taste for justice. She met his gaze. Marcus tried to kill you, tried to steal everything Victor built. I'm not letting him walk away from that because we were too cautious to bend a few rules. Elias considered the idea. It was risky, potentially illegal, and exactly the kind of aggressive move Marcus would never expect from him, which made it perfect. All right, he said, but we do this smart. We need someone who knows locks, who can get us in and out without drawing attention. I know someone, Clara said. Samuel's nephew. He worked as a locksmith before he came to work in the stables. I'll talk to him. 3 days later, under cover of darkness, Elias and Clara rode into Redemption Springs. Elias's side still ached, but Dr. Chen had finally cleared him for light activity, and this qualified as light compared to what he'd already survived. Samuel's nephew, a quiet young man named Jacob, met them in the alley behind the land registry building. He worked on the lock for less than a minute before it clicked open. I'll keep watch, Jacob whispered. You've got maybe 20 minutes before the night patrol comes around. Elias and Clara slipped inside, closing the door quietly behind them. The office was small and surprisingly organized, Marcus's influence evident in the neat arrangement of files and ledgers. Clara lit a small lamp, keeping the flame low, and they began searching. 10 minutes yielded nothing but legitimate business documents. Elias was beginning to think this had been a wasted trip when Clara pulled a ledger from the bottom drawer of the desk and went still. Elias, look at this. He moved to her side. The ledger contained a second set of accounts, parallel to the official ranch records but showing different numbers. Money skimmed from supply contracts, falsified sale prices, kickbacks from buyers. It was all there, meticulously documented in Marcus's precise handwriting. Why would he keep this? Clara whispered. It's evidence against him. Because he's arrogant, Elias said. He never thought he'd get caught, and he needed to track his own theft to make sure he wasn't shorting himself. He felt a grim satisfaction settle over him. This is what we need. This will convict him. They heard footsteps outside. The night patrol. Early. Jacob's low whistle of warning cut through the darkness. Elias grabbed the ledger, and they moved quickly to the door. Jacob had it open, was gesturing urgently for them to leave. They slipped out just as lamplight appeared at the end of the alley. The ride back to the ranch was tense and exhilarating. They'd done it, found the evidence that would seal Marcus's fate. The trial took place in late August, when the desert heat was at its most brutal, and tempers ran correspondingly short. The courthouse was packed, standing room only, with half the territory present to witness the downfall of the Hale dynasty. Marcus sat at the defendant's table looking every inch the wrong gentleman, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, his expression one of wounded dignity. His lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Hendricks, had built a defense based on character assassination, painting Elias as an ungrateful foundling who'd manipulated a dying man and fabricated evidence out of jealousy and greed. The prosecution presented Clara's testimony, Brennan's account, and the physical evidence from the canyon. But Hendricks was good. He raised doubts about Clara's credibility. Wasn't she romantically involved with Elias, making her testimony suspect? He questioned Brennan's timeline. Could he really be certain of what he'd heard in a crowded saloon? He suggested the body in the canyon could have been anyone, that the alleged connection to Dean was circumstantial. By the third day, Elias could feel the case slipping away. The jury looked uncertain, swayed by Hendricks's eloquent arguments. Judge Morrison seemed troubled, clearly weighing the evidence against reasonable doubt. Then Graves presented the ledger. The courtroom went silent as the prosecution walked through each entry, each discrepancy, each theft documented in Marcus's own handwriting. Hendricks objected repeatedly, claiming the ledger had been obtained illegally and should be inadmissible. The ledger was found during a legitimate search of Mr. Marcus Hale's business office, Graves countered smoothly. Jacob had been willing to swear he'd been hired to check the locks on all downtown buildings, which gave them legal cover for the entry. And regardless of how it was obtained, it proves a pattern of theft and fraud spanning 3 years. Morrison allowed the evidence. Hendricks's defense crumbled like sand in wind. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and announced the verdict in a voice that carried to every corner of the packed courtroom. On the charge of embezzlement, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty. On all counts, guilty. Marcus's face went white. Dean, seated beside him, simply collapsed, sobbing into his hands. Morrison sentenced them both to 20 years in the territorial prison. As the bailiff led them away in chains, Marcus looked back once at Elias. The hatred in his eyes was undiminished, but there was something else there too, a grudging recognition. Elias had won, not through privilege or birthright, but through refusal to surrender. Outside the courthouse, people congratulated Elias and Clara, shook their hands, offered words of support. The town's opinion had shifted decisively. Elias was no longer the charity case, but the victim who'd fought back and won. Graves found them as the crowd dispersed. "It's over," the lawyer said. "Truly over. The ranch is yours free and clear. No challenges, no threats." "Thank you," Elias said, "for everything." "Thank Miss Thompson," Graves replied, nodding to Clara. "She's the one who found the evidence that won this case." After Graves left, Elias and Clara stood together on the courthouse steps, watching the sun descend toward the western peaks. The desert stretched around them, vast and unforgiving and somehow beautiful in its harshness. "What now?" Clara asked. Clara Tassum. "Now we rebuild," Elias said. "Everything Marcus damaged, we make right. The ranch, the reputation, the trust." "That'll take years." "Then we have years." He looked at her, and the words he'd been holding back finally found their voice. "Clara, I can't do this without you, not just as my administrator or partner, but as—" He hesitated, then pushed forward. "As someone who stands beside me. In everything." Clara's breath caught. "Elias, are you asking?" "I'm asking if you'll marry me." The words came out more certain than he'd expected. "Not because I need a partner for the ranch, though that's true, but because I've fallen in love with you. Because you're the bravest, smartest, most stubborn person I've ever known. Because when I was dying in that canyon, the only thing that kept me fighting was knowing you were there." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." He kissed her then, there on the courthouse steps in full view of anyone who cared to look. And Clara kissed him back, pouring into it all the fear and hope and love she'd been carrying. When they finally pulled apart, she was smiling. "This is going to cause so much gossip." "Let them gossip," Elias said. "I stopped caring what people think a long time ago." They married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with Tom Brennan standing up as Elias's best man and Mrs. Patterson as Clara's witness. No grand celebration, no society guests, just the people who mattered, who'd stood by them through the darkness. Dr. Chen attended, a rare smile on her severe face. Graves was there, looking satisfied in the way lawyers do when their case is resolved properly. And the ranch hands gathered to witness their boss marry the woman who'd saved his life. The work of rebuilding began immediately. Elias and Clara worked side by side, reviewing every contract Marcus had signed, correcting the damage he'd done, restoring relationships with buyers and suppliers. They paid back the embezzled funds to the ranch accounts, took out a smaller loan to cover the bank payment, and restructured the mining operation to actually turn a profit. Clara proved to have a genius for organization and negotiation. Where Marcus had used intimidation and manipulation, she built partnerships based on mutual benefit. Within 6 months, the ranch's reputation had not only recovered, but improved beyond what it had been under Victor. Elias, meanwhile, focused on the land itself. He implemented rotation systems that gave the pastures time to recover, brought in new cattle bloodlines to strengthen the herd, and invested in water conservation that would protect the ranch through droughts. The hands responded to his leadership with loyalty that Marcus had never earned, respect born from seeing their boss work harder than anyone and treat them as partners rather than servants. One evening, nearly a year after the trial, Elias and Clara sat on the veranda watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Clara's hand rested on her stomach, where new life was just beginning to make itself known. "Do you think Victor would be proud?" she asked quietly. Elias considered the question. "I think he'd be satisfied. He didn't leave me the ranch because he thought I was perfect. He left it because he believed I'd do the work. Make it better. Build something worth leaving behind." "You have," Clara said. "Look at what you've created here. Not just a successful ranch, but a place where people are treated fairly, where merit matters more than blood, where second chances are possible." "We created it," Elias corrected. "You and me. Together." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge. The desert night was cool and clear, the kind of night that made you feel small and significant all at once. "What should we name the baby?" Claire asked. "If it's a boy?" Elias was quiet for a moment. "Victor," he said finally, "after the man who gave me a chance when no one else would. And if it's a girl," he smiled, "Hope, because that's what she'll represent. The future we're building. The proof that goodness can survive brutality." Clara nodded, tears pricking her eyes. "Hope Hale. I like that." News reached them occasionally about Marcus and Dean. Marcus had become the model prisoner, working in the prison library, keeping to himself. Dean had fallen apart completely, requiring isolation for his own safety. Neither would ever see freedom again. Elias felt no satisfaction in their fate, but no guilt either. They'd made their choices, lived with the consequences. That was justice, not revenge. The ranch continued to grow. They expanded carefully, buying adjacent land from families who wanted to sell, hiring more hands, diversifying into horses and sheep alongside the cattle. Clara took over the complete business operations, her sharp mind and ethical approach earning her respect, even from men who'd never thought a woman could manage such things. And Elias became known throughout the territory as a fair dealer, a skilled rancher, and a man whose word was absolute. People remembered he was a foundling, but it became a point of pride rather than shame, proof that in the Arizona territory, a person could rise or fall based on character rather than circumstance. 5 years after the trial, on a bright spring morning, Elias stood in the same study where Victor had once made the decision to name him heir. His daughter Hope, now 3 years old, with Clara's sharp eyes and his dark hair, was playing on the floor with wooden blocks. His son Victor, barely a year old, dozed in the cradle nearby. Clara entered carrying correspondence, her role as the ranch's administrator, now so natural that visitors often assumed she'd been born to it. The bank sent notice. The last loan payment cleared. We're debt-free. Elias looked up from the contract he was reviewing. All of it? Every penny. The ranch is ours free and clear. No mortgages, no liens, no obligations except to ourselves and the people who work here. He stood, crossed to her, and pulled her into an embrace. Hope looked up from her blocks and giggled at the sight of her parents together. We did it, Elias said quietly. Built something real. Something lasting. You did it, Clara corrected. I just helped. No. He pulled back to look at her. You saved me. In the canyon, yes. But also before that. You saw me when I was invisible, believed in me when I'd stopped believing in myself. Everything we have now exists because you refused to let me fall. Clara's eyes glistened. We saved each other, Elias. That's how partnerships work. That evening, as had become their tradition, they gathered the ranch hands for dinner. Not a formal affair, but a family meal where foreman and owner sat side by side. Tom Brennan was there, now married to the widow who ran the general store. Dr. Chen attended when her schedule allowed, along with Graves, who'd become more friend than lawyer. They ate and talked and laughed, and for Elias, it felt like the completion of something that had begun that day in the desert, when a dying man had looked at a nameless boy and seen possibility. After the meal, after the guests had departed and the children were asleep, Elias and Clara returned to the veranda. The desert night embraced them, and Elias thought about all the paths that had led here, the hunger and survival, the cruelty and endurance, the gunshot and the stitches, the courtroom and the verdict. Do you ever regret it? Clara asked. The way things happened, the violence and pain? Elias considered the question honestly. I regret that it was necessary, that Marcus and Dean couldn't just accept the truth, but I don't regret surviving. Don't regret fighting back. He paused. And I especially don't regret finding you. Smooth talker, Clara teased, but her voice was warm. I learned from the best. He squeezed her hand. Thank you, Clara, for everything. Thank me by building something so strong that our grandchildren will still be working this land. By making sure Victor's legacy, the real one, not the twisted version Marcus wanted, lives forever. Deal, Elias said, and he kept that promise. Over the decades that followed, the Hale Ranch became legendary throughout the territory, not for its size, though it grew substantially, or its wealth, though prosperity followed their ethical practices. It became legendary because it represented something rare in frontier country: justice, second chances. Second, the idea that who you were mattered less than what you did. Elias and Clara raised 4 children, each taught to value fairness over power, partnership over domination. They expanded the ranch into a model operation that other ranchers studied and emulated, and they never forgot where they'd come from, the desert that had tried to break them, the canyon where they'd almost died, the choice to keep fighting when surrender would have been easier. When Elias Hale died at 83, peacefully in his sleep with Clara beside him, half the territory came to the funeral. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch beneath a simple stone that read, Elias Hale, born nowhere, built everything. Clara lived another 7 years managing the ranch with the same sharp mind and ethical compass that had saved Elias's life all those years ago. When she joined him on that hill, her stone read, Clara Hale, the woman who refused to let him fall. Their great-great-grandchildren still work the land today, still tell the story of the foundling who became a legend and the maid who became a partner. The story of betrayal and survival, of justice delayed but not denied, of love born in the crucible of violence and tempered into something unbreakable. Because true legacy isn't inherited through blood or bought with money. It's built through choice and character, through standing up when it would be easier to stay down, through refusing to let cruelty have the final word. The desert remembers. The land remembers. And the story of Elias Hale, the boy who saved a dying man, the heir who survived murder, the rancher who built an empire on principle rather than privilege, lives on. Not as legend, but as proof. Proof that goodness can survive, that justice can triumph, that one person's refusal to break can change everything. The ranch still stands, the name still carries weight, and somewhere in the desert wind, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the echo of two lives intertwined. The orphan and the maid, the survivor and the savior, building something beautiful from the wreckage of cruelty. Building something that lasts.